Hello, everyone. By my count, it's 6 o'clock. But that's better. That's better still. Hello, everyone. How are we all doing? Can you all hear me? That's good. Hello, Albert. Nice to see you first. Let me just get this. Believe it or not, as of this moment, we have no iron brew left in the house. It's terrible, but more arrives tomorrow, so it'll be okay. But this is the last iron brew, and I have drunk a lot this weekend, sorting things out. So, salute. Hello, Bichon. Hello, Shormac. Hello, Osprey28. How are you doing? Hi, Night Heron Productions. Hi, Ian Carr. Hi, Blue Shirt Buddha. Hi, Thomas Rottweiler. Hi, Jay Illingworth. I haven't seen the CIA yet. Thank you, Sean Mack. Hi, Gordon Collins. Hi, Steph Thompson. Hi, Michael Rose. Hi, Golden Eagle. Hi, Kevin McTaggart. Hi, Carmen Gasberg. Hello, Kyle. Hello, Daniel Freeman. Hi. Hi, Brock. Hello, everyone. Right, then. Hi, Elfenhund. Hello, everyone. So, how are you all doing this evening? I hope you're doing well. It's just a fun topic. Hi, Martin. I have to admit, duty. Thank you, Kevin. Can I brew run now? No, it's on its way. It'll arrive. It'll get here tomorrow. But thank you very much. It will go. That will go towards more iron brew. I have to say, today has been a rather random day because I've been doing a lot of one-to-one tutorials with students today, and it is kind of strange doing this sort of video conversation one-on-one with someone and talking about their work. I'm used to doing it face-to-face, and it is... I'm playing a little game, whether they're rooms that they have me sort of they set their cameras up in are as I'd imagine them from having met them before, and B, this is the most strange thing. It's very interesting. You see their facial expressions the whole time because it's on the sort of screen in front of you. Whereas when you're sort of reading the paper when you normally get it and you're chatting with them, you're not as intensely staring at them. So it's quite a surreal experience having that all day. Hello, Carl. Hello, the Liga. Hello, Stephen. Hello, Paul. So thank you very much. And I will want to say, I sometimes forget this, but thank you very much to all those people who do super chats because they are really, really, really very useful. It's quite fun with YouTube. You sort of watch all the stats of all the things going in, and the super chats do go all to the Iron Brew Fund, and the Iron Brew Fund really gets me through a lot at the moment. We might have to work on the Iron Brew addiction at some point, but we won't for now. It's useful. Will he be using the book Disaster in the Far East? Actually, today I have to say I'm being a bit naughty. I'm going a bit off book because when I was reading through the books, they're all very good at focusing on the Far East, and i.e. the Pacific, or particularly Southeast Asia. But none of the books bring together the Indian Ocean campaign that well, and I have quite a lot of them. In fact, I can show you. I have... Let's just twit it around. If you look at the bed, there is a whole pile of books sitting there at the moment, which are what I've been going through today, and they're just some of the ones that I've been going through today. I have been going through quite a lot of this set, that set, the boxes, and I was going through them for about the last week trying to set this up, and I ended up going back to National Archives documents I have took pictures of years ago, because years ago, when I was first doing my PhD thesis on aircraft carrier and naval aviation development, I wanted to use the Indian Ocean as one of my case studies on how carriers were used, particularly HMS Formidable and Indomitable, those two ships and how they get used in the Indian Ocean campaigns. Which is why I'm fairly confident when I start talking about Somerville in the Indian Ocean and various other things, because I've been looking at it for years myself. But the more I've got into it, and the more I've been sort of going at notes, the more I've realized looking around that there are some very good little concise histories of specific operations going out there, and some very good little personal accounts. But there is nothing which takes the Indian Ocean and treats it as a proper theatre of war, which it was. It's always things like the Battle of the Atlantic spilled over into the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is a theatre itself. It doesn't spill over from one ocean to another. They're going to that ocean because it's a worthwhile theatre of operations. And, it's terrible. Hello, the CIA. Albert, but if it makes you feel better, Iron Brew is unknown here in Poland. That's just terrible. I feel sad for Poland. We've got to research. That pedestal convoy needs to go to Poland. We need to run it through. I do have a fairly large number of books, and yes, me and my girlfriend have had a conversation about if we when we hopefully eventually set up house together. We reckon the first thing we're going to have to look at is buying the place is going to have a library facility. Fortunately, everything's sort of been put back, job market and all these things. But, we'll get there eventually. Work it all out. She has to get through her PhD thesis first, and I have to get a job. Well, how do I put it? Not a job, but I have to get off the contract lecturing gig and onto something which is a permanent income. It's annoying. Lots of universities like to employ me as their contract lecturer, but, naval history and military history isn't the research funding vogue it used to be. Although it does cause some very interesting, fun conversations where you don't get the job and then you get called up a couple of weeks later going, would you mind coming in and doing this as a guest lecture? Why? The person we've hired is an excellent researcher. Why? They turn out to be not that great at teaching. Oh. Luckily, I'm mercenary enough for those universities that I do tend to just take the money and go and do the teaching, rather than holding them as ransom. So, but back to the topic of today. Royal Navy operations in the Indian Ocean from 1941 to 43 as proposed by the CIA. Kevin Taggart, just live on university campus. Ooh. Fourth Sea Lord. I was considering third Sea Lord. They don't currently have one of those. I think I could be done. I'm married to a librarian. Our books here, our books haven't. You can find the book. Oh, Albert, I love that. I love it. This should be it. You need to start grant chasing. That is the thing. I'm actually quite good at getting grants. My girlfriend and I are both quite good, seem to be at getting grants. The trouble is, they're not the right kind of grants for the universities. They're the lots of money to do what we want to do the conferences and things we want, but they're not the kind of grants which they sort of go, wow, this is something we can put in newspapers, because they all want to chase the big grants from the big funders. that's a lot of competition. You never get them. Whereas I tend to go for the funders who are nicer and more personal. Paul Johnson, Dr. Clark, knock Diane Snow on the head and take over from him on the telly. Why do you think I'm doing all the mysteries of the deep stuff? You know, that's the thing. Carmen, I work in a museum, so my library is my work, but it's closed for the year. You poor, poor man. I feel so sorry for you. That's terrible. All right. Anyway, we'll get off the joy that is academic work and the work treadmill. And I'm rather enjoying myself at the moment because I'm just about to have a book come out, a couple of journal articles, and I'm doing all this, which is a whole lot more fun. Just wait and see what is going on in China, India, US. I know. I actually have friends who have done that. I think I'm the only one in my year group from King's College London who graduated with our PhDs who's still in the UK. They all seem to have gone abroad, but I'm not sure. There could be one or two who I just never bumped into. There's quite a lot of PhD students in King's College War Studies. So, let's get back into this though. Royal Navy operations in the Indian Ocean from 1941 to 43. The first thing you've got to realise is what the Royal Navy is trying to do. Now, what the Royal Navy wants to do. And for this, there is, well, pretty much, there is one book which acts as a bit of a narrative. And that's Andrew Boyd's The Royal Navy in Eastern Waters, Linchpin of Victory. Or as I like to call it, especially when I'm doing the Indian Ocean, the Royal Navy's principal units in Eastern Waters, Linchpin of Victories. Basically, anything which is cruiser above will get discussed. Destroyers. Well, the picture says it all. It's from a battleship's deck looking at an aircraft carrier. And also, he very much is concentrating on the Bay of Bengal area. This part, the Arabian Sea. Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know, yes, Michael Clapp is going to be a guest on Bilge Pumps. We're doing amphibious warfare. I think Jamie would like the concept of having my girlfriend on Bilge Pumps. In fact, I think he'd love to do a thing of having my girlfriend and Mrs. Drac on there and have them, the topic being living with an Alex who's a naval historian. Or having an Alex as your naval historian who's your life partner. What the hell are you? What went wrong with your life that ended up being this scenario? Oh. Go on, Eagle. Dr. Clark, I'm doing engineering, man. What is the best way of getting into war studies? Just apply to King's College London. There's a few good departments actually around the world which are good at it. Master's programs are very good. Very soundsy. Good evening. Good evening. Thomas, I'm reading Boyd's book at the moment. Taking a while, but very interesting. It is very interesting. I look. The trouble is, I have just finished writing a book about destroyers, as you all know, and it's now with the publishers and all that fun is going on. And I come from the Andrew Lambert style of naval history, more, and the Norman Freeman side to extent. Andrew comes from the Nicholas Rogers side. And there isn't much difference between those schools, I suppose. There isn't much difference, but there is enough that when I'm reading through this, I'm thinking, yes, that's interesting, but that's the ships which are doing that. That's lovely, but doesn't there need to be this going on, and what else is going on, and why those ships are there, and what's happening with that, and what's the task group composed of? Because one of the interesting things I find when I'm looking at the Indian Ocean is you've got a lot of ships which are, even more than any other theatre of war, you have ships, ships being used for jobs which they weren't necessarily designed for, and filling in roles. And it's no surprise to me that in 1944, after D-Day, the next place the Tribal class destroyers go is the Indian Ocean. That is where they head to. They don't go out to the Pacific Fleet. The Pacific Fleet has got more than enough destroyers, more than enough cruisers. These go to the Indian Ocean because the Indian Ocean is always, to an extent, a make do with what you can get fleet. It's like one of the interesting scenarios that you have for the Indian Ocean when dealing with Operation C is that Somerville has 3 carriers pretty much at his disposal. One small one, one older one, 2 modern fleet carriers. He has land base there. He has all these things, and the Japanese are doing a dispersed operation. He could have, in theory, done a lot more, and we'll get into that. But the thing is, what's really crippling to Somerville's operations? It's his destroyers numbers. It's always his destroyer numbers. Jeff Ealer, remind Michael Clapp to plug his contribution to the new book. But, or living with an iron brew addict. That could also be the topic. Yes, my girlfriend is trying to sort of work out how much she wants to live with the iron brew addict, I think. And how much iron brew will have to be in the facility. Thomas Ryder, you can get Boyd's thesis free download. Yes, you can. You can't get mine because King's hasn't set that up yet. Taken years. It's finally got cleared. It had bits in it which weren't appreciated by certain other historians and government. It had a very, very revolutionary take in it, let's say. But that's another time for another discussion. Shormack, Partial and Tully need to write another book. Could be quite cool. Carl Harmon, Dutch Clark, what's your advice to work in a museum historian if uni is out of question? I'm looking at a course with the Association of Museums. I'm sorry to be off topic. Don't be sorry to be off topic. That's a good question. And we are in the bilge pump slide, so we're not really that much off topic. My advice is if you want to do it, find a museum. You have to, if you're going to do it, of course, never go on a course which doesn't link up directly with a museum and doesn't include some sort of apprenticeship time was served. Hi, Ian. You want to make sure you've got an organization that will help you in terms of helping you get the experience you need, because museum work these days is in part waiting for people to die, like any work in history is, sadly enough, and in part it's about experience, it's about being known, and it's about making sure you have some values going on that can help you. Thank you, Jeff. It's very kind of you. Jeff Ealer, what happened in the ocean in 1943 before the build-up to 1944? We're going to get to that. That's the end of this one. The whole thing is it goes from 1941 to 43. So once we get into it, we'll get into it. Gone cons. Carl Harmon, looking into the museum studies course at Leicester Uni, I found it opened a lot more doors for me. Yes, Leicester Uni is very good at this. Pick a university which is good for getting you into the jobs you want to go to. Okay? There are universities which are very good for academic standing, have these huge research standing, and actually aren't that great for getting into jobs you want to go to. Classic example is King's University, which I work at, right? So research-wise, if you're looking at it, you're going to go, oh, Cambridge is the better university. This is the better university. But a large number of the Cambridge engineering students don't go into engineering. They go into banking and other things because they emphasize the problem-solving mathematical side of engineering. Kingston University students, we have Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, Northrop Grumman, Babcock, pretty much every major engineering firm you can think, which is to do with civil, mechanical, or aero engineering, turns up in the second year to chat to our students. We have SpaceX turning up, all these things. Why? Because King's University students, whilst the university doesn't rank so high on the research rankings, ranks really high on teaching engineers practical problem-solving skills in terms of doing engineering. Our students do a huge amount of lab work in comparison to other universities. They do a huge number of site visits. It's a very practical-orientated course. which is great if you want a career in engineering because they have it linked up. So, yes, this is going off topic and this is my bit of my hobby horse, but yes, look at universities and look at their rankings. That's lovely. But don't stop with your investigation there. Check and see what the course links up with, which companies, what you want to work at, what you want to do, what are you looking for. If you're talking about history, okay, well, do you want to become a professional historian, or do you want to use those history skills to go and work in various companies? Do you want to go do a law conversion course afterwards? Do you want to go and work for Google, who hire a huge number of historians because they work very well as translators for IT to English and English to IT? All sorts of areas can be opened up with the degrees if you work out which degrees suit you and which kind of jobs suit you. So don't think of, as I was trying to tell students, don't think of GCSEs, A-levels, and university degrees as things in and of themselves. Think about where you want to get to in the future and work your way back. So yeah, oh no, Revolutionary Take is now my next patron suggestion. Ooh, that could be fun. So Thompson, I want to send if I get a warning shot, but Doctor, you said you were on a break from brew because you've had a bit lately. Just concerned. I finished it off. I had a lot yesterday. I had some left today, and I'm on a bit right. I take 5 days off usually. If I had a large amount of iron brew, I would take 5 days off. And technically that starts now the bottle's finished. Carmen, I'm currently general assistant in the museum and curator, and assistant curator are willing to help to the course trustees. Also seem willing to, so I think it's a good course. I'd be paid, and it's a learn on the go. That sounds like an excellent course to me, Carl. I'd definitely do that. Shomack, the community college. Golden Eagle, yes. Well, I've taught there. Drakenfennel also studied his degree there. So Kingston is a very good course for that sort of engineering. Shormack, the community college in my town has a direct feeder program to Tesla. Ooh, cool. That is a good one thing to know. Gordon Collins, I don't know much about the MA course. It's not something I have much experience with. I did do the Leicester course, Alan. So, Tom, good rule to go by. Yes, I've been in the university system long enough that I know that some of the things which are used in the league tables look good on the league tables as they are things you can measure. They don't necessarily match up. It's like my advice usually if you're a dyslexic or anything dyspraxic like that is you want to look at a medium-sized university, not a massive university, because they usually will have roughly the same size of support network, but a lot less students to deal with. Jeffila, what was the role of HMS Hermes when she was not in refit or being sunk? She was the trade protection carrier. She was doing the cruiser carrier role. And she was doing that very well to free up the fleet carriers to do the strike roles and do their other missions. Tom, okay, basically you learn on the go and then go do a talk for a broad profession. That was after 5 years, remember, right? Oh, cool, that is good. Right, so I know I use this regularly, but getting into today's topic, how the Royal Navy sees the world does matter. And it is rather special. I always love the way that resets sometimes when I do this. So, the Royal Navy is looking at the world as a trading world, as a place to trade. And that's what they've got to protect, because the British Empire that pays for the Royal Navy, that pays for Britain, is a trading empire. And those thick bands are critical. And those are all ships which are of a size where if they get lost at sea, it actually worries the British. So when you start going through that, and you start considering, as I was talking earlier in the introduction, prior to Italy entering the war, you already have the trade starting to head down the coast of Africa, which is why I'm always surprised at how few targets the Graf Spee actually managed to get, because trade is heating up in that area and there isn't much of a convoy force at that time. There isn't much of a convoy going on. Most of the convoys are starting at Freetown, which is up in the Gold Coast area, and so the stuff down in South Africa and the southern area, below equatorial Africa, are far less protected. But hey ho, and it goes round into the Indian Ocean. Now, the Indian Ocean is rather a critical area for the British. As you can see, the Bay of Bengal is especially full of trade. This is critical for three things. One, it is how food is moved around India, because remember, the railway lines are not as they are today. The railway lines at the time are mostly designed for getting the things inside India to the ports of India, not for getting stuff round internally India. There also isn't the heavy road or truck network necessary for moving things. So this is a critical thing, and this is a critical economic area. If you look at those sort of where the big massive ships are, there is a huge concentration of ships in the area. Now, traditionally, of course, they go through the Suez Canal, but also the Red Sea. Hence, the Red Sea starts off with some very interesting protectors. And the Indian Ocean starts off World War II with some very, very strong forces present, mostly of the cruisers kind. And you've got the carrier based in the Far East with the China Squadron, China Station, but they have some very prevalent forces. In fact, it's all centered around 3 Town-class cruisers, who have been there for quite a while, which shows you the importance of the Indian Ocean Station, but also how it functions into the British deterrence methodology, which is why when I do put the point of we should have based 4C back on Colombo, or, back in Trimcom Lee, I am not taking it from nowhere. There is a significant naval presence already based there, and basing the force in the Indian Ocean to deter the Pacific is quite a standard practice for the British to do. In fact, battleships and carriers from the Mediterranean regularly make visits to the Indian Ocean in peacetime. They'd come through to the Indian Ocean, do an exercise, do something, and then go back. So they were not far away, but they were also, it was a demonstration to the Japanese, we can come this way, you can't do anything about it, but you can't really reach us. Because for the Japanese to get to, let's say, the Royal Navy's main operating base in the Mediterranean, well, that would be a rather long journey and wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Even for them to really get into the ocean was going to be a rather difficult one. I've been having this discussion down in the comments underneath the introduction earlier, and the sheer distances you're talking nearly 6,000 odd miles journey in any one direction to get there. That's a very, very long and difficult journey to work out and to get your forces through, especially without being known. Ian Carr, not much trade with Russia. Indian Ocean was considered a British lake. Pretty much by Martin Doherty. Yes, to an extent it is. Britain isn't trading much with Russia. There isn't much trade with Russia thanks to what happened in the White Sea, but there is some trade going through up into the Baltic. Not much going into the Black Sea area, I have to admit. But the Indian Ocean is not just a British lake. The Indian Ocean is a critical area for British trade because you have Australia, you have South Africa, you have India, which are 3 of the critical dominions, pieces of empire. The next one is Canada in their critical mass. And so you have 3 which border on the Indian Ocean. So controlling the Indian Ocean and being present there matters. But the Royal Navy never really bases battleships or anything there in peacetime because of infrastructure reasons, largely. You have the infrastructure built to support it to an extent, and if you consider the amount of refits Royal Navy warships go through in Mumbai, they do certainly have the facilities there. But there is also a limitation to what you can forward base in peacetime and support on the budget you're allowed. And that is really the critical thing. It's the budget you're allowed. So, there is also the interesting thing in the command structure. Now, East Indies Command is a rather interesting set of officers and rather interesting set of analysis. It's mainly based on Colombo, but they do move around. And it is usually, how can I put this politely? Well, the East Indies Station doesn't always have the best track record for senior officers. In fact, honestly, your run of officers prior to Somerville, who is, it's 1938 to 39, Somerville is the vice admiral out there, and this is part of the reason. Okay, so there are two types of officer which get sent to the East Indies. Because the Royal Navy operates a system where the China station is the boss admiral of the Far East, so they're usually a full admiral. Okay, so that means the other stations are usually commanded by a vice admiral, East Indies included. So that whilst they are technically an independent station and technically an independent command, the fact is there is a very senior person who is there. Now, 1939 to 1941, there is Sir Ralph Letham, who is actually a full admiral. And then it goes Geoffrey Arbuthnot, who's another vice admiral. So there is a sort of a bit of thing. But these are officers who they are very politically connected, but not necessarily trusted, some of them, to actually do a war fighting commands. Alexander Ramsay is a good example. He becomes Chief of Sea Lord and Chief of Naval Air Services after he's East Indies. So he's the first, I think, of those. And he retires at his own request in 1942. He's promoted to Admiral in December 1939 and retires in 1942. In the nicest way, at the time when the Royal Navy is really short of senior officers, really desperate of senior officers to deploy around the world, do all sorts of things, he is requesting to retire in 1942 and is allowed to. And he's not exactly that old in 42. He is 61. He, could do easily another 4 years in the Royal Navy, especially as he's a full admiral, but no, goes. Frank Forrester Rose is another example. He is replaced by illness. He commands a small ship HMS Laurel and the Battle of Heligoland Bright. He's promoted to Rear Admiral in 1929, so that's not that long ago. He commands the destroyer flotillas Mediterranean Fleet in 1931, becomes Commander-in-Chief East India Station in 1934. This is an officer who you would expect to be on the rise up, and then in 1936 is replaced due to illness and dies in 1955. Doesn't get called back for World War II. Let's look at the full admiral. Well, Ralph Leham, pretty much, he retires in 1946, and his posts are in World War II. Flag officer in command Malta from 1941, so he's a good officer. But he's been transferred away from the East Indies to take command of to fight the Italian Navy, becomes deputy governor of Malta in 1943, and briefly temporary commander-in-chief Levant before becoming commander-in-chief Plymouth later in 1943, retires in 1946. So he's involved in D-Day. So you either have good officers who get transferred away quite quickly, or you have officers who, frankly, are being left there. It's not necessarily the best post for a vice admiral to get, the East Indies. Jeff Wheeler, I like how the ocean is split amongst 3 areas. No one is responsible for the whole ocean. That is the other problem. But technically, it's not really split amongst 3 areas because, as I said, you've got the East Indies, Australia, and New Zealand, all technically end up reporting in a war scenario to the China station, who is the full admiral out there. Yeah, the Royal Navy did structure this. Yeah, it wasn't like if you look at the equivalent command structure out in the Far East and the Middle and Indian Ocean region for the Army and the Air Force, they're all much of a same rank. And the ones who are of the senior rank don't have the staff to do it. The Royal Navy, you look at it and go, well, the Commander-in-Chief China Station had a staff of only 40. That he couldn't coordinate a whole war. Well, actually, he had access to the way the naval command structure worked. He had access to the personnel on his flagship to fill out quite a lot of his staff roles as well. And often, when you use junior officers for doing that, so they get some staff experience on the flagship. And when you have operator distributed command structure and you expect any fleet to be deployed out to you to possibly come with quite a lot of staff officers with it, it makes sense and it works. What are they there to do? Well, they're there. The staff are there to provide the planning for a major war and to keep the facilities available for a major war in peacetime and to keep the force in peacetime running. You don't need as much of a staff as you need for a major fleet operation. And if your fleet, you're going to have your rapid reaction come from a training, that's the case. So the whole of the Indian Ocean is structured really around, and the Far East is structured around that fleet arriving from the Mediterranean, that fleet arriving from home if there's a major war. But in peacetime, and for that transition period, when they've got to be deterring until that fleet arrives, that is what they're critical for. So that is what shapes the ships which are present in the region. The peacetime presence mission and the deterrence / initial engagement management missions. And also that affects their structures. Paul, didn't a lot of retired admirals become commodores and lead convoys? Yes, a lot of them did. So when they don't, that's kind of a big clue that something was a bit of an issue. Quite a lot of retired admirals will quite happily go and become convoy commodores. When they don't, Stafford Thompson, illness contracted on station or back home? Did TB strike again? Illness was contracted on station. Paul, Jeff Beeler, Cornelius Barnett wrote a lot about the weakness of British technical education in his Pride and Fall series of books. Yeah. Again, that's whenever I start reading these books and I'm looking at them, these sort of books, and I read them, I sit there and go, but you're basing it presuming that that model is better than this model, or this model doesn't suit. And you have to look at what produces it out at the end. British technical education tends to produce fairly decent technical work, if we consider what it's coming from in its period. I have to admit, maybe it's suffered in some recent times because of the emphasis being placed on university as the primary route. But having gone and taught in some colleges occasionally, when they've wanted me to, I've always thought some of the colleges were very good. And quite a lot of the universities which are doing very well these days are the ones which are the former polytechnics. They've just been given, we haven't lost them, they've just been given university status. Because it looks better to say you've got more universities than say you've got a polytechnic, apparently. Ian Coombs. It doesn't look like at the time we had much interest in the Pacific. Was that more to preserve the US? In terms of trade, it was to an extent to preserve the US, but it was also, how do I put this? The Pacific was, in to an extent, our trade is talking about stuff mostly coming back to the UK rather than doing the trade between places. It's the trade between UK and out is what we were concentrating on. It's where the bigger ships were. There was a bit of trade within the empire, but not the main routes. So the main routes going across the Pacific were between Japan and the US and to the USA. So those would be mainly US ships on that one. That particular map shows where the British merchant ships were. And largely where the British merchant ships were going one way rather than doing the cross Pacific to the America and other side of the America route. Because if they're going to America, if we go back quickly, if they're going to America, if you look at the trade, the vast majority of the British ships, the trade to America is going to their east coast rather than to their west coast. But some trade does go there, and there is some trade going backwards and forwards between Australia and between Japan and Australia. You see, we know where these routes are. That's one of the critical things. We do have these routes, and it's like you can see some of the trade routes going down round the coast of South America and up to the UK. So, and of course, fair number are going through the Panama Canal. There is trade there, but yes, it is far more American in the Pacific than it is British. And that affects how we're sort of planning things because, again, it means we can actually do slightly different things in a war scenario. In many ways, the Pacific was the perfect place for the British to fight a war because it would be away from our trade routes. If we could have fought a war which was against Japan in the Pacific in 1939, rather than fighting Germany, Italy, Japan, it would have been absolutely amazing. Because all our trade is that side, and if we could put a big enough fleet in Singapore and keep the Japanese the other side, and possibly have to put a force down in the Falkland Islands as well, then we can bottle up the Japanese for years and keep our trade and our economy functioning. Javila, was there a Pacific Squadron or just West Coast RCN? There was. If we go back, there is the America and West Indies Station, which does include quite a lot of Royal Navy as well, which going about across there. And again, the American West Indies Station is one of those interesting ones because if you're talking about the Atlantic side, they fall under the command in any major war of the local home command of the fleet command and North Atlantic Station to an extent. And any ships which are in the Pacific fall under the China Station's command. Yes, it's a fun station to be in. It's a very, very fun station to be in. It's a lot of Canadian units, but it's also a lot of British units wandering around there. Remember, Britain is a navy with aiming for 70 cruisers. We can spread them around in peacetime, and 200-odd destroyers, several battleships, and a whole myriad of sloops and other things. There are ships spread around by the Royal Navy everywhere, as well as on top of the ones which are provided by the Commonwealth navies and the Empire navies. Please note, I am drawing a distinction between those two groups. I still love that in the Indian Ocean, because the British Empire shows up so rarely on some of these islands, and that might explain some of the things that happen on those islands. In World War II, the Royal Navy, when it's going around, not just taking the Royal Marines aboard the cruiser that are part of the crew anyway, and part of its landing force anyway, are actually taking a reinforced company, to an extent, about 100, I think this was, of the Northamptonshire Regiment as extra soldiers. Steph Thompson, a bit of a sidestep, but you were right once again, Doctor. Edmonton is dropping Eskimos as their team name. Doubt we'll get a warship again now. It's rather sad. It's a good name for a warship considering its history, but Paul at Dr. Clark. By the time of the Indian Ocean raid, the experience of air attack in the Med would still be fresh. Why were the AA fits or ships so weak in weapon systems and fire control? They weren't. Okay, yes, some were still being updated, but most of the ones which had been, most of them had been updated quite well. But the thing is, most of the air attacks we're talking about are when you've got penny packet ships formations being attacked into. It's kind of like the Indian Ocean raid results in a similar scenario to what you have in the Battle of Malaysia, in that you have penny packets of British and Allied forces thrown together, ending up fighting the full might of the Japanese. And you sort of go, why? Dorsetshire and Cornwall are the classic examples. They actually do have, for their time and for that period, a not terrible AA fit and a not terrible AA organization. But the thing is, if they had kept on the route they planned and done the sort of wide circle round to Somerville's force, yes, it would have probably been an extra 12 to 18 hours for them to join up with him. But they would have, by the time they were attacked, would have been well out of range of any Japanese aircraft. Which, if you're a ship on your own, the best defense you can have against your enemy aircraft isn't air defenses, it's distance. It makes it more difficult for them to find you, and it makes it less likely for them to be able to mount a strike. And the whole thing about Somerville was, in the nicest way, the British predicated this scenario of dealing with a fleet when you have got a situation like you're dealing with the Kido Butai turning up. The whole British scenario is, we hold back, we skirt you as much as we can, and then at night, we smash. And then we pull back again. And then the next night, we smash if you're still around. We don't hang around during the day within range, and we certainly don't come straight down within range, highlighting our position and where we're coming from. The fact that the Japanese didn't think, why are those cruisers heading in that direction, and think, oh, that might be where Somerville's fleet is amazing to me. Vision. The Canadian Pacific Navy at least advertised travel between Japan, China, and railway. At least advertised travel between Japan, China, and UK via sea rail route using their ships and trains. I'm curious how much trade there was by sea rail route. Not as much as the Canadian Railway would have liked there to be. Jeff Beeler, New Zealand station gets Hawaii. Technically, yes. It's considered nice. Jeff Beeler, the CPR had Empress liners going to the Orient. Yeah, they did. The Canadian Pacific Railway did have all sorts of things going on there. Paul Johnson, at the clock, what percentage of the British population were in the Navy? I honestly have no idea, but I doubt it was that massive. I think it was probably 0.5 or... Let's see. I think the Royal Navy was... not that strong in the interwar period. We're talking probably well under 100,000. Probably well under that, and not that strong, but in the interwar years, not a big percentage. Ian Carr, Royal Marines usually manned ex-turret in the RM as well as in land duties. Was this common across navies? No, it wasn't. It was mainly the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy did that because you had the Royal Marines on the ship anyway. And So you had the Royal Marines there because they were going around. It was part of the Imperial policing. You had the Royal Marines as part of the ship's crew, and if you had to send a land force, Marines formed up, and they were your nucleus of your landing force. You needed that because the ships were doing the presence mission, were doing the policing role, and I see that as a future for the Royal Marines, definitely. In other nations, the Royal Marines were far more infantry, far more your military component of your naval service, who would be kept together as a unit and would be sent in. The Royal Marines traditionally have actually straddled this line with being both partially the sort of boarding team, landing force, unit aboard a warship ready to be deployed when it needs to around the world, but also being since World War II, a brigade-sized formation which can be deployed en masse if necessary. And it's a fairly interesting assignment because they do need to be, if you think about it, because they're always going to be in small numbers, they do need to be really quite well armed and quite efficient. But I'd say I do still worry about them, especially with the Commando 21 concept and the literal strike ships. So Thompson, really, the Japanese didn't put two and two together in regards to Somerville? No, they didn't. They didn't. In fact, honestly, the saving grace for Somerville was that as much as he was, to an extent, reacting to the Japanese, they seem to have had no idea where he was at any time. And you can say this because he passes quite close to the Japanese and they do not do anything. He knows where the Japanese are most of the time. Most of the time, he has a swordfish or albacore with air-to-surface radar keeping track on the Japanese formations. Mm-hmm. Daniel Dog's Clock, re-IGN, and this may be a bit technical, but was there lighter AA 25mm rubbish due to doctrine or just being a crap gun mounting? The Type 96. It just seems to be a bad mechanism. It seems to have all sorts of problems with accuracy and all sorts of problems with jamming. I don't think it was actually. There are so many authors who seem very willing to put it down to quality control and say the Japanese were somehow bad at quality control. I don't think they were. I think they're mass producing the best design they could make, and I think that was part of the problem. If you look at the British design for the pom-pom and the British design for the various cannon they're using, the Oerlikon especially, they are far more simple designs. The Japanese were going for the best, what was on paper the best design you could possibly make. But as I've said often, the best is the enemy of the good enough, and the trouble is the best often requires the most maintenance. And in a saltwater light weapon scenario, it's not good. Maybe you do that for your primary gun, which is absolutely critical. It must be the best. But your air defense gun can afford to be good enough if you fit in enough numbers. So Thompson, Dusklock, continued. I see two ships. Question 1. What bases are close by? Question 2. Are my squadrons in the area? Question 3. What heading do I need to intercept and withdraw at dusk? So Thompson. So really, the Japanese didn't. No, they just two ships. Yeah, that was the thing. They didn't. They went for the kill of the two ships, which you can understand, bird in the hand and all that. But if they'd followed them, they might well have found the whole Royal Navy force. Daniel Max Royal Marines. Did you write 78,000 maximum Royal Marines? I don't think the Royal Marines have ever been 78,000. 7,800 at the moment. roughly. But their brigade is formed with some rather interesting with army additions, and there's commando engineering regiment, commando logistics regiment, all sorts of army stuff gets attached to the Royal Marines. It's kind of interesting. It's an interesting system. Ian Coombs, would the current naval strategy for Allies coalition be to try and bottle up China, effectively stopping them projecting their naval strength further afield if it came to a shooting war? Probably. In fact, honestly, I am surprised a lot of the plans for fighting Japan haven't been brushed off for the ideas of fighting China. And again, for the ideas of fighting Russia, it was always a case of they want these lovely bastions. We'll let them sit in their bastions and we'll choose when we go in. We'll put them in there. Maximum Royal Navy about 78 million, 78,000, I think. Daniel Freeman, UK population about 47 to 48 million. Yeah, I don't think it was ever sort of really a massive percentage. Really not. Ian Carr, Japanese 25mm was also low velocity. Yep. They were going for what looked like a technical solution, or technical, what was considered the best technical solution. As I said, Daniel Freeman, Dr. Clark, 78,000 is what Naval History Net Wikipedia claims for 1945. Yep, that would be about right. I said well below 100,000. Well, but I think peacetime, it was probably roughly about 50,000, maybe even less. So, yeah, the naval force was not a lot of personnel. Not a lot. Don't front line. Nagumo didn't know about Abdu at all, where Somerville refueled his fleet? No. The Royal Navy had managed to be fairly good at hiding their fleet, hiding their forces and where they were based. And partially that was thanks to dealing with things like the Admiral Graf Spee and other German surface raiders. The Royal Navy had realized they had to be very efficient at hiding where they put their put things. Hello, Potter. Love this morning video as always. Oh, thank you. What was interesting to me again that the Graf Spee goes in and makes this kill. Also, can anyone tell me on this morning's video, did any of the cards I placed work? Because I go through and I place them on YouTube so they show up little cards with links to other videos. But I never know if they work or not because YouTube doesn't really tell me if they work. Did the Singapore strategy secret refueling bases help the RN at all? Yes, it did. Those bases were very useful. The ones that, let's put it this way, the sheer amount of fuel stored in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and in Australia were critical to the British operations in British and American operations in the Southeast Asia and Indian Ocean and Pacific. To an extent, the British never needed to worry about fuel. Yes, they were getting more supplied forward, but they never. They had quite a lot of stockpile there, sitting there for them. They'd keep the fuel coming, but it wasn't. Let's put it this way: the Navy was never really worried about running out of fuel in those scenarios. Oh, top right. I spotted a couple up top right with links. Thank you. That's good to know. Top right. So probably on the white patch of my screen design. I'm going to have to fix that at some point. I'm going to have to. Daniel Freeman, you're showing off, but that's good. I'm glad you get to watch on your TV. Oh, and actually, while I remember, Pantorotri, that's what. I know the RN had 2 mobile bases. One was committed and lost in Crete. Was the other used at Abdo Atoll? Actually, the Monabs, there is a very good book about, and I have that somewhere around me. Where is my Monab book? It came out a few years ago, and it's a very, very cool book all about the mobile naval bases. It includes stuff about HMS Unicorn and other things. I think it's up there. Excuse me a second. Just check it's not there while I charge up there. No. I have to get it out. But there is a very cool book going around about monabs and all they do. And all the way around. Well, Daniel, you have kept asking for work, and I decided that I'm going to volunteer you as a moderator. So that there's, just in case we, there's an extra moderator around. Yeah. David Hobbs did it, and I do have it somewhere, but I can't find it for the life of me at the moment, which is annoying. It could be down there, but that's a thing to get to. And mobile naval bases, moving bases, Royal Navy maintenance carriers, and monabs. Produced in 2007 by David Hobbs. It's currently £4.41 on Amazon. So I will put a link to it in the thing. If anyone's interested in hearing about moving about monabs, they're pretty darn cool what they get up to. Yeah. Jebila. The Iron started training its staff as boy sailors and midshipmen quite young. What technical edge does this give? It gives the Royal Navy a lot of defensive depth. The thing is, the Royal Navy had the advantage that they had a lot of depth in positions. It's like when we're talking about the staff officers and the staff of, the Admiral and the China Station. Midshipmen would often be on the flagship, and often from other ships in the fleet who were out on, especially midshipmen who were out in their first crew, would often do time with the staff, but they wouldn't be counted as staff officers. But you'd actually have about 20 or so doing it. So you'd have staff experience starting quite young. You'd also have any spare lieutenants, any spare officers who weren't needed because their ship was currently in dock or all sorts of things, would also be drafted into staff for planning to keep them busy. Basically, to give them, you didn't want idle hands because, idle hands make all sorts of problems for admirals. So keeping people busy on foreign stations is a good thing. The staff is a good space for this. So actually, to an extent, the admirals didn't want a heavy staff on a distant station because then they wouldn't have things for other people to do when they found them temporarily unemployed. Thomas Rottler, what role did naval intelligence play in determining Somerville's actions? He knew Naguma's general plan. Despite that, Naguma's planes caught the defenders on Ceylon asleep. The trouble is, Somerville is playing a very... The Indian Ocean is a critical area, and their fighting is critical in terms of securing it. But... and this is the big problem. Some people suggest Somerville was worried about losing these assets because they were critical things to the Royal Navy's strength. Well, I would point out that the Royal Navy's handling of carriers and battleships throughout World War II show that the Royal Navy's quite prepared to lose them when they think it's necessary. But I think the whole time he's reacting like he's been surprised when he hasn't been surprised because of the intelligence, because of the information. Yes, he didn't know quite the whole Kido Batai was coming his way. he thought it was merely 2 or 3 of them. If he'd realised it was the full force, probably he'd have asked for the Mediterranean carrier to come, and the Eastern Mediterranean carrier could possibly have made it to him in time, considering when the information came through. It would have been a stretch, but it could have been there, and he could have then had a free carrier battle group to force it. If you consider what turns up for Operation Ironclad and all those things, other ships could have been made available for the Indian Ocean Force to really make it strong. Emily, Hobbs is about 60 Canadian dollars. It is literally. Sorry, this is Jeff. This is absolutely upsetting me because the hardcover edition. There is a brand new book in the UK for £6.39. The hardcover is £4.41 new. I don't understand why it's so expensive of you. It seems cruel. I do love, though, that Amazon is now recommending me as an author to follow to myself. Because I'm now kind of complaining about this. But, you know, hey, Inca, every nation on Earth seems to have brought a license from Sweden to manufacture 40mm Bofors. Why didn't the Japanese? I have no idea on that one. It would have been sensible to, and honestly, Sweden would have sold it quite happily. I have no idea. The 40mm Bofors would have made such a difference to the Japanese fleet. It would have made air defense a really far more practical thing, even without radar. Let's see, get it. What resources and intel sources did the Japanese capture at Singapore? Okay. This is one of the interesting things. Because Singapore has very much a managed surrender, the British managed to destroy pretty much everything so the Japanese don't get it. However, they capture a lot of critical people, especially a whole radar unit and all sorts of skilled technicians who are out in the Far East and based in Singapore, which really do help them in certain areas in that they provide extra information when suitably motivated for development of... No, that's not MONABs, is it? No. For development of their Japanese own radar, but they don't really help out as much as the Japanese probably would have liked them to. They're not as cooperative for a defeated force as they thought they would be. It happens. It's not particularly fun for them, though, and the Japanese do go out of their way to try and motivate them. Definitely. Paul, in some of his recent books, Max Hastings criticised the Fleet Air Arm for its development of aircraft and its doctrine during the war. Would you agree? Not really. Okay, Max Hastings is Max Hastings, and we'll leave him to one side. But in World War II, the Royal Navy has the trouble with the Fleet Air Arm is they only get control of it in 1939. They immediately step in and order very major engines, which are critical for aircraft which are produced from about 1942 onwards. But the trouble is, every time the Royal Navy tries to develop a new type of aircraft to use those engines get first requirement for the Royal Air Force, And so the Royal Navy ends up dependent upon procuring American aircraft and getting what in effect are reconditioned British designs. Seafire is a great example of this. So the Royal Navy does have a very good doctrine, but the trouble is the reality of what they get. There's your doctrine, this is what we like. The reality of what you're going to get. Well, if the US Navy wants aircraft and the Royal Navy wants aircraft, the odds are the suppliers are going to supply the US Navy before the Royal Navy, which is annoying. If the classic example is the Firebrand and even to an extent a few of the, a couple of the other fighters, which the Royal Navy is sort of working on trying to develop during World War II, trying to get the engine they want, they're not getting. Also, Max has this wonderful idea, which I'm not sure where he gets, that the Royal Navy two-seat fighter was absolutely most absurd. It really isn't absurd when you're thinking when you've got a doctrine of long-range strike, and when you're still developing radar, you're still developing beacons, and you're still developing navigation. And if you're going to do long-range night strike, having an observer for help with reconnaissance as an extra set of eyes and help with navigation makes sense. It does. Might not be how Max Hastings would do it, but that's reading history backwards. Knowing it. And it's presuming what came was necessarily right, or what the Royal Navy was aiming for was what they got. Not necessarily always the case, and the Royal Navy is often making best of what they managed to get hold of, and they do quite well with that, I think. They're not perfect. There are some big flaws, but interesting enough, me and Max Hastings disagree on what the flaws were. In my mind, he jumps on things which are not actually flaws of their own creation. There are some flaws of their creation. There are some big flaws of their creation. The Barracuda is a good example of a flaw of their creation, because it's trying to do everything in one. But it's actually a sensible aircraft, but it's trying to do everything in one at a time when you don't have the technology to make it. They want to make an aircraft which can be both a torpedo bomber and dive bomber, and it's just... no. Turns out to be quite a good aircraft in the end. Benefit in cost Canadian taking account. Stop being cruel for it, Daniel. It's nasty to taunt poor Jeff. I remember reading that the Japanese dived on Prince of Wales for its radar, but due to the ship laying upside down, it was impossible. They were certainly after a lot of technology, trying to get technology if they could. Boom. They're still developing two-seat single-engine fighters late in the war. Yes, long-range strike, navigation. And also, they work quite well. The two-seater heavy fighters have worked pretty well on the Malta runs and in the Mediterranean. They have been quite a sensible aircraft in terms of if you're doing the long-range operation. Yes, you can be comfortable with the Mustang flying long distances over land, and the P-38 launching from land bases. But you have to remember, on a carrier, the carrier is moving, and the aircraft are moving. And then you've got the navigation problems of it. So you can understand why a service which is worried about losing aircraft unnecessarily would be still considering two-seater fighters and still working on them. It's not stupid. It's logical. They don't have GPS at those times. The carriers have beacons they can turn on, but those beacons advertise their own positions. So that's giving away to also the enemy if they're detecting it. You've had problems. The whole reason for the second person is because A, those fighters have a reconnaissance role, and B, those fighters are supposed to be long-range escort fighters and long-range scout fighters, as well as being fighters. So it's the dual role thing. You don't just see it. You have to not look at them as just being fighters. And for goodness sake, the F-14 was a two-seater fighter. The FA-18 F, or is it? Yeah, F is a two-seater fighter. The E-18G Super Growler is a two-seater aircraft. You often, when you have enough roles to be done, you operate with a second person. Even in modern computer world where we have all these different systems to take on. So just looking back and going, it's two-seater, so it must be bad, is not actually looking at it. It's thinking, okay, if you're designing for, what are you designing for? Ask yourself, what's that aircraft being designed for, and then is it bad? Is it bad for what it's being designed for? It's like the Skewer is a terrible fighter. But the Royal Navy was getting and procuring under the title fighter so they could buy a dive bomber. It's actually an excellent dive bomber. Skewer is possibly one of the best dive bombers of World War II. Gonigan. Why did the Brits not use 3.7-inch guns as dual-purpose guns, or rather triple-purpose guns as AA anti-tank guns, anti-ship guns? They could have, but really they were preferring to standardize on the 4-inch and later on the 4.5-inch. 3.7 does get used for some things. Inca, nobody seems to have championed the Bristol Centaurus during the war. Not enough people know. Angerson, the USN was happy to give the Corsairs to the RN US Minimum Sea. Yes, because they didn't think they could operate from the carriers. Once they saw the Royal Navy managed to operate them from carriers, they then wanted them themselves. Tom Fryer, second person in fighter also useful for sending Morse code, not easy when flying a plane. Exactly, another role which you need if you're doing reconnaissance. Just being RN got the Sea Fury in time for Korea. That she did, and they were good. They took out. They're the piston aircraft which took out jet fighters. And Firefly was a good attack aircraft. Yes, it was. Actually, I have something I can. If we're going to quickly wander into aircraft. I am considering this for something. Because I did this a few years ago. There you go. That could be interesting to you. Hey, yeah, we're up to the tribal class. And tribal class were also, of course, out in the Indian Ocean for quite early. They were out there in the Red Sea. Quite early. To make their point and their presence felt, because the Royal Navy was worried about the Indian Ocean, but they couldn't detach as much force as they wanted to at the time because they were dealing with the Spanish Civil War. They were dealing with the threats of the Germany, which were primary. So you send out your pocket cruisers, your cruiser fill-ins, to cover the Red Sea. Cover that trade going through there and keep an eye on the Chinese. Well, not the Chinese, on the Italians. Sorry. Hungry. Haven't had my tea yet. Sorry. Jeff Miller got the Hobbs for $15 from Book Depository. Good for you. You'll enjoy it. You will enjoy it. It's a good book. It's also got HMS Unicorn in it, which is one of the cool things about it. I originally got it and then found out all about Monabs and then went off and did some research for them. Jeff Miller, Kudo worked in cool weather over Norway, but not in a hot weather plane. not original versions anyway. I think largely because Royal Artillery kept better control of their assets, so AA focused on AA, AT focused on anti-tank, rather than being tanks light tank. Yeah, they did try to, and the Royal Artillery needed to. And one of the interesting issues we have with the fall of Malaya is that so much of stuff lost. If you think about it, that kit is lost in penny packets again. If that kit had managed to be concentrated in any way, shape, or form, the Japanese, even with their tanks they did have, and they did have superior tanks to what the British had out there, would have been overwhelmed because there were sufficient anti-tank guns, etc., to cause their tanks a lot of trouble. If someone had actually taken the thing to set them up. Paul, the F-18 and F-14 were both twin-engine aircraft. Yes, they are twin-engine jet aircraft, but just because twin-engined two-seat doesn't make it necessary. You don't necessarily have to have two persons because it's a two-engine, and just because you have a single engine doesn't make it bad to have a two persons. It's what are you using that aircraft for? Yes, I would like a twin-engined aircraft, but honestly, when are twin-engined aircraft do they start being used off the carriers? Well, you only really have the British putting in versions of the Sea Mosquito for night fighting at the end of the Second World War, almost after the war's over, to get two-engine aircraft on their carriers. Carrier aircraft are single-engined aircraft, or at least single-propellered aircraft. Some of them are contra-rotating systems and all sorts of things once you get onto the Fairey Gannet and these sort of scenarios. But it is usually what they're talking about in terms of what they're doing. They are talking about the naval they're talking about the aviation and the missions they're going to be doing at the time. Then re-UK Bofors for the moon. UK did have them from 1937, but for Army rather than RN, and only had a few by September 1939. Yes, that was the trouble. It was stepping up production. This is why the Royal Navy was focusing on the pom-pom, because the Army was getting the limited Bofors production because the Navy didn't want to go to sea with a mixture at the time. They preferred not to go to sea with a mixture. So the Royal Navy basically said, right then, whilst we can cram on a lot more, and if you consider how many pom-poms they were cramming on ships, we'll take the pom-pom, you take the Bofors. And once Bofors production is stepped up, then we'll take the Bofors. And that's what they do. Production. Sorry if I brought it up previously, but what would have made a Mosquito a good carrier aircraft? Besides the speed and armament, I imagine the two-man crew would have been appealing to World War II CVOPs. Yeah, all those things would have been useful, but the thing which would be most useful would have been a really massively reinforced landing gear. And that actually was what they'd ended up having to do a lot to take the British existing two-seater aircraft and turn them into two-person aircraft, twin-engined aircraft into carrier aircraft. Quite a lot of them had to have quite a lot of work done on the airframes and on their landing gear. Strub, how many different rates do the RN have in World War II? I honestly have no idea. I should probably know this one, but every time I do any research, I seem to come across a new rate, a new person with a new sort of role. They seem to generate quite a lot in World War II. Some appear, some disappear quite quickly. So honestly, I have no idea how many rates they have during World War II. Paul, in his book on the invasion of Poland, Wojciech concentrates on how the Polish arms industry linked up with the British military procurement. They were quite useful on that. Paul, the Poles got the license from Sweden. There was a trade deficit with the UK rearms, so the UK took the Bofors for the armies. Yeah, that doesn't really surprise me. Anyway, back to the Indian Ocean, because that is our primary thing today. Now, at this point, it's surface raiders, which are really the annoying thing in 1940. The Ranger Marina doesn't really start work till the 7th of June, and poor Ranger Marina, and I do say poor Ranger Marina, immediately when they start work, they find that their submarines have some big issues. And this is part of the trouble of doing long-range infrastructure work. The British Army also finds they have issues because they've been told they have to defend British Somaliland, and they've been given about 5,000 troops to do it. And the Italians have about 20,000 troops in Italian Somaliland that are prepared to come in and go, hello, we'd like to make this ours. Because the whole British idea had been that there would be enough British forces free elsewhere to go up and do what they needed to do when they needed to do it. Trouble is, mounting the BEF had kind of sucked troops from everywhere, as not necessarily those troops had gone to the BEF, but you'd had to move some troops to go to BF, some troops to cover the troops that went to the BEF, sort of where they went, and therefore you have troops moving all around the place, and that means you don't necessarily have enough where you need them, and don't have enough on call. Massawa is an interesting place, though, for the Italian Navy, and it's where they are concentrated on. But the Royal Navy, once they found they're not really doing much, and their main issues are Atlantis and Penguin, they get to work with dealing with Atlantis and Penguin, and they do slowly try and deal them. Dorsetshire has a fun time. She managed to shell Italian Somaliland, which causes the Italians no end of upset, but seeing as they don't really have much there to be shelled, it doesn't really matter that much. And really, what the Royal Navy is doing in the ocean at this point is convoy, 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 convoy. It's kind of like a Battle of the Atlantic in miniature going on. But it is its own battle. It's its own theatre, its own battle. It's got its own rhythm. As I said, I hate it when people just go, the Battle of the Atlantic spills over in the ocean. There is actually its own rhythm going on. Ian Carr, early 1941, Italian successes in the Red Sea. This led to the US considering it a war zone and not safe for their ships delivering supplies to Egypt. How was this resolved, and where was the transshipping? It was resolved by, well, escort convoys and some transshipping taking place in the Cape. Excuse me. Actually, bless you. Some stuff taken care of in the Cape, but mostly it was organized to be what it was meant to be. In terms of, very quickly, the Royal Navy concentrated on beating back the Regia Marina and crushing the Regia Marina. Early in 1941, the Italian ceased to really be much of a force in the Indian Ocean, and then the big problem becomes the Germans, like this particularly interesting vessel, and the Japanese later on. The Italians have some success at the beginning, but it isn't much success. And the beginning sort of period, they have some success with their submarines, but they do an attack on a Royal Navy convoy, and their 4 destroyers get beaten off, and one of them gets sunk. There's a video of Eric Brown landing a Mosquito on a carrier on YouTube. Yes, there is, and it's the first time I think they landed it on a carrier, and that's, him doing it. Seth Johnson, I heard a rumor that the USMC was looking at bringing back their Skyhawk, the last radial ground attack plane, to work alongside the Warthog. Any credence in this? Typed as you moved on. Not any. They often look at these things, but I doubt they're going to. I think often when they start looking at these things, I think it's a plea for a certain type of UAV or something to support them. It's usually a plea for, we need more ground support. and they find other ways of doing it. But you do look at some pretty radical ideas sometimes as part of the procurement process. The problem with carrier landings is the Kadabar landing is more a crash so hard on the aircraft's landing gear and structure with tailhook yanks back. Yep. While the short takeoff distance means you need lots of power, it takes more than just putting C in front of the name. Yeah, that is half the trouble, and also, especially catapults. You basically the whole Katabar system is controlled crashing. It's either a almost a crash pushing you forward, rapid acceleration, and stresses on your gear, and same with landing. Which is why airframes have a limitation to the number of landings and takeoffs they can do before they have to be very heavily maintained or withdrawn from service. Minority Seafire had major undercarriage issues with the heavy landings on carrier decks. Yep. Thank you, Angus. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Stefan. Technically, the General Aircraft Fleet Shadower was a multi-engine aircraft for carrier use, but was only ever a prototype, and is so ugly we do not mention it. I can have fun with it occasionally. Paul, BAE charged the UK government for design changes to Queen class to allow for Kadabar in the future. I wonder if they actually did anything other than raise an invoice. They did, but that's jumping ahead of this. There are some things in them, but basically the Queen Elizabeths are designed that they could be converted to emails, Kadabar. But I wouldn't. It would be a very, very expensive job if they had to, and it's not really sensible. Anyway, so onto this beautiful surface radar, the Albert Shear. Oh my god, I just said it beautiful. It's so not. Seriously, I know I've already said this today in the recorded video, but whenever I look at these ships, the more and more I see those turrets, the more and more I think whoever was designing this was compensating for something. That's the only excuse, because that should have been an 8-inch gun. And timeline they were building in peace. They could have developed an 8-inch gun for them. It would have been sensible. They were developing an 8-inch gun for the Hipper class, all these things. They had 8-inch guns on their own. Putting 8-inch guns in them, or 6-inch guns, would have been far more sensible. 8-inch guns would have been justifiable. Putting in a nice treble 8-inch gun turret forward and a treble 8-inch aft would have made them so much better. Because you could have done so much with that extra tonnage. So Thompson, I think she's pretty. Yeah, you can stuff her, but I don't know. Jean Carl, twin-engine Seahorn used of carriers was smaller than a span of Mosquito. Yep. She had a lot of modifications that she did to take the Sea Hornet over the Mosquito. Jeff Beeler, Skier looked better with the pointy box. Pointy bow. You can do whatever you like to the bow, but frankly, the superstructure I find interesting itself, but I can understand it and I can agree with it. Although you can see some linkings up between the Japanese and the German design schools in terms of this pagoda construction. But the turret and the fitting of the 11-inch, I cannot forgive. I just do not understand it. Ben Gargan. Dr. Clark, is the emails conversion more plausible if the next carrier design already adopted them with Kadabar air wings and it brings the QE to new spec? There is not going to be a next carrier. There could be an LHD, in which case they would also be ramps if we had it, and then frankly I would stick with Stovall, because if that's what you've got as your system and you can use it off multiple decks, you do it. For a medium power, Katabar is not necessarily the best way to go. I would often argue that looking at France, that if they developed a Stovall aircraft and had a Stovall carriers, had a couple of them rather than going for a nuclear Katabar carrier, and had their Mistrals fitted up with ski ramps, they could have 5 flight decks that they could use if they needed to, so they would actually have a more reliable generation of air power. and more reliable on-call organic air power for fleet global power projection and fleet operations. But they didn't. They've gone for Kadabar and they've gone for helicopter carriers. Turning 343. Atlantic Bell does help a bit, but as it was seen as a capital ship replacement, wouldn't putting 8-inch on them look a bit too much trade ship killer? Yes. But it would have been sensible. Ooh! Something's just rowing. Ankle. Yep. Ankle. Tea. What about 9-inch two and Jebula? What about 9.2-inch guns for the shears? They could have gone with that, but anything the 11-inch, no. 11-inch. Look at the size of that turret. Look at how big it is on that hull. Look at the stresses it's going to place on that hull for operations. This is half the problem with them. And honestly, the 11-inch is too big for practical surface freighter operations, I would say. I'd say you don't need an 11-inch. If you're taking on merchant ships, an 8-inch is more than fine. Danny Freeman and Stafford Thompson, you both are commenting that the shear looks like the Type 45 with its mast. Yes, it does. It does. Ambition. For raiding light cruisers are best given that their raider needs to avoid combat and avoid a mission kill. Still, what's wrong with 11-inch guns unless you can add more 8-inch? Is it rate of fire? It's rate of fire, it's stress on the hull, it's size of mechanism involved, it's complexity, it's all sorts of things. Look at how that turret and how those guns are sitting on that hull. Even in that picture, when it's not moving, tied alongside, you can see, if you look carefully at the hull, the stresses it's going under. Jeff Beeler. She had Aegis mast without radar. Yes. 11-inch gun. The ship, because the ship is replacing had 11-inch, and by treaty they could do it. Yes, they could. They were replacing the pre-dreadnoughts, but no. It's not sensible still. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. It's going for something which is style and top trumps over something which is practical. Plus, 8-inch would have had a faster rate of fire, which would be useful, but it would also be able to carry more ammunition and it would have a better turret profile for it. Trent McCarthy, Dust Clark, are any modern warships built to battleship design principles of having enough armor to defend against its own guns at certain ranges? Nope. British modern warships are largely constructed on the standard of subdivision and being able to do lots of damage control, basically. And Avalzaski, didn't Germans still have cruiser size limitations, Versailles Treaty, as well? So a ship pretending to be close to 7 islands had to be classified as a battleship? No, not really. Various naval treaties, etc., had taken over from there and had given them put in new limitations. So the Versailles Treaty had been superseded in certain areas. And there was also the League of Nations and various other agreements in that. Turning 3434, unfortunately, political reality does not take sensible into account. Nope. Otherwise, that would have had 8-inch guns. The Deutschland class had the same armament as a Leander class in their secondaries. Over armored for their role, classic battlecruiser era without that being that big. They weren't even battlecruisers. This is the thing. For a battlecruiser, they'd have to be fast, but these ships have a maximum speed of 26 knots. Most of the Royal Navy could outrun them and outspeed them. The whole point was they had to run away the whole time. And if you're going to have to run away from enemy warships anyway, why are you carrying 11-inch guns? If you'd had the 8-inch guns, you could have carried more powerful machinery, more fuel for the same displacement, and you could have got away at faster speeds. Which ship is that? That is the Albert Scheer. Admiral Scheer. That sounds like John say. Ben Grogan. Douglas Clark, there won't be a new carrier is a never say never, which you usually advise against. We both know ships will need replacement. I'm not talking near term. I'm thinking 40, 50 years. Okay, 40 to 50 years, yes. But I'm sorry, I got... How'd I put it? I had a very interesting... Before I started teaching this morning, I had a very interesting phone call with some people who are basically going, yes, and when the third carrier is built, there won't be a third carrier. So that was my morning, and that was basically the idea was the Royal Navy is going to get funding to build a third Queen Elizabeth class, which is going to be nuclear powered and have emails, and then the 2 gas powered ships will be upgraded to emails, so we'll have 3 Cadabar carriers. And I was going, no, can we have something which is sensible, please? Can we get back to a sensible idea, please? Can we, please? Daniel Freeman, Pocket Battleship. A clear example of just because you can doesn't mean you should. Yep. Angus O'Donnell, did the 11-inch guns perform a presence role? To an extent, they gave them a slightly more top trumpish presence because I've got bigger guns than you. But to be honest, the Royal Navy mostly went, yeah, but we can outnumber you with 8-inch cruisers and 6-inch cruisers wherever you go. So you might have bigger guns, but you'll only have 2 turrets, so you'll be able to engage a maximum of 2 targets at a time, and we'll make sure you're never engaged by less than 3. Albert Scheer herself is about 5 charging down on her, plus an aircraft carrier. That wouldn't have been the River Plate. That would be in the Annihilation, like North Cape. Goniel, Dr. Clark, that reminds me, how much will steel metallurgy advance in World War II, and how much protection can battleship armor made of modern steel be offer versus World War II British battleship armor? Well, it could potentially offer quite a lot, even more protection, but they just won't do it. You do other things. Kevin Tanger, Dr. Clark, what is the crane used for in the picture? Is it to load torpedoes or shells? I think it's just a loading crane. I think it could be used for torpedoes and shells, but if you want to. That particular crane, I have a feeling it would be used to load whatever was needed to be loaded at the time. Paul, Deutschland class were also slow. Just for speed considerations, didn't that make them obsolete and their end entirely predictable? Yes, their top speed was 26 knots, but the really is to go 26 knots was a rarity. That was their full speed. Golden Eagle, they were armored cruisers. I go with heavy cruisers. I treat them as heavy cruisers. That's what they were. Then I think the best way to view it is that any new carrier won't be built in a time frame where the current aircraft or ship design are likely to be relevant. That's my theory. So Thompson, we might get an LHD with ski ramps. We won't get new carriers. It depends how we can make the case for replacing Albion and Bulwark. Staff Thompson, what would you consider something with a triple 6-inch forward of a forward of VLS coming in around 16 to 18,000 tons? Figure is Spey related. Well, if it's got twin or triple 6-inch forward, then it's probably sitting in the cruiser range. Especially if it's 16 to 18,000 tons, it's definitely sitting in the cruiser range. I think if you can call a destroyer a 14,000 ton ship a destroyer, I think you can probably get away with a 16 to 18,000 ton ship being a cruiser. Turning free for free. Oh yeah, the third CVN funded by all the money Brexit will save instead of having to invest to become a viable independent political entity on your own. look, whilst I agree there is a measure of realism needed on both sides on that case, I would say that the British economy isn't that bad. And if you consider when we want money for things, our upper class can produce it quite quickly. COVID-19 response being a classic example. Sure, Mac. I totally forgot that their speed was 26 knots, so much faster than anything that can outgun them. A QE can keep pace with them. A Queen Elizabeth battleship could have actually outpaced them, especially one of the refitted ones in the interwar major refit ones, i.e. Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, or Valiant, could have outpaced them. Renown and Repulse could have outpaced them. Hood could have outpaced them. Pretty much every single cruiser in the Royal Navy could outpace them. The Tribal class destroyers could have outpaced them. I'm trying to think of Royal Navy ships which couldn't outpace them. Paul, Tony, the Turks paid for warships prior to World War I by public subscription, which made the UK confiscating them even worse. Yeah. Yes. Danny Freeman, 20,000 ton sloop, 84,000 ton dinghy? Wait till the time comes. Osprey 28, Rule the Waves 2 is leaking. It probably is. Right, we're in 1941, so I'm going to increase this a bit so we can talk a bit about 1941 and what they're doing. And this is where you get some sort of the interesting things. You have Admiral Scheer decides on the 3rd of March 1941 that, frankly, Hermes, Glasgow, Cape Town, Emerald, Hawkins, Shropshire, and Canberra all coming to say hello, all going, we just want to say hello, is enough that, frankly, it doesn't want to be there. It would like to be anywhere else but there. They do actually at one point, and the thing is, the critical area is the Madagascar area for the Royal Navy, and this feeds into one of the reasons why Ironclad gets launched, I swear, because the Royal Navy is dealing with the fact that all these surface raiders operating in the Madagascar area, and they don't have a base around that area that they can really base from. They have Cape Town, but that's on the transition, and they do have forces there, but that's dealing with convoy issues. And they have all the stuff up north, and Madagascar sort of falls, especially some of its ports, in the middle to provide a good area for linking up for basing of convoy protection and deterrence units. Because, again, you don't want to have too many major units in this area because you need them to fight the war elsewhere going on in the world in 1941. But at the same time, you do want your areas to be safe. Now, Formidable is also fun because what she gets up to, she keeps popping in. She basically spends most of February and a bit of March in the Indian Ocean. So the idea that the Royal Navy wasn't sending its major carriers into the Indian Ocean and wasn't worrying about the Far East is sort of not quite correct. Formidable's turning up. She's beating down on several opponents quite rapidly. Mishram, the pocket battleships may have been built more for prestige and practicality, thus the 11-inch guns. Yeah. Fearless. So what happened in Indian Ocean in 1943? We're at 1941. 43 comes after this. There's 42 first as well. All right, we'll get there. Shomac, the R class. Got Revenge class can't outpace them. And Nelson's kind of amazing. To an extent, but honestly, they might not be able to outpace them. But again, how much long can that maintain its maximum speed, the Deutschland class, and also if they've been operating at long range from their country, from Germany for quite a while, their hull's going to be fouled, so they're going to be slower anyway. It's just, it's not really a good scenario for them. Not really good in scenario. Dynamic production. One of my nightmare scenarios for a phony war is either HMS Hood, Renown, or both catching the KMS Deutschland in Denmark Strait in November of 39. Spoiler: it doesn't end it doesn't end well for Deutschland. No, it wouldn't be. Paul Schormack. Read an alternate history novel by Anthony Williams where the R-class was scrapped, and as the RN realised the 15-inch guns were more valuable on modern hulls at HMS Vanguard. The trouble would have been actually building those modern hulls and getting permission to do them. They would have been more useful on modern hulls, but they weren't available to it. Angus Sonum, was it part of the Shear's mission to tie up Iron Forces? Did this make openings elsewhere? In theory, that is what surface raiders were for, but the trouble is, especially at this point, it's going to sound strange. If Shear had turned up in December 1941, that would have been a massive issue. Because Royal Navy had been facing off Japan, Italy, and Germany, and, all around the world. But actually, turning up in March 1941, they still have significant force available. They have not... it's turned up early enough in the year, they haven't yet had the losses of that year. And that's the point. When the Japanese finally get involved, the Royal Navy's had a lot of losses, and they're going to have more in 1942. But a good example I often give is the fact that in most of the ships, if they survive 1942, survive World War II. Well, a large chunk on it. And it's your certain D-class vessels. Ian Carr, a Force D, Operation Appearance. Bring your own harbour in the form of modified lighters from Aden to Berbera for reoperation of British Somaliland. Ad hoc shades of D-Day? Yeah. Force D was an amazing scenario for Britain, and it's also one of the first successful opposed amphibious operations of World War II. Daniel Freeman, late 1941, what if Force Z had Indomitable with them? That is an interesting question, which we get into. Okay. So if you have Indomitable there, the theory is you would also have the Indomitable's escort, which would be far more... you would have some more destroyers there, which came with her. You would also probably have a Dido-class crew, air defense cruiser, or at least one, possibly two. And some other ships with you. So you would have had a far more rounded force involved. The fighters would have probably broken up the attacks, a la what happened in the Mediterranean. So the force would have had a far better chance of getting away if they made the decision to get away. Plus, another admiral would have been there. Comes front runner. Although Leander sank Ram 1, her sister Ram 2 and the sloop Eritrea managed to avoid Iron to get from Eritrea to Kobe, Japan. Yeah. They did manage to get there. They did have some fun sometimes. And some successes. You have to remember, I'm always very skeptical when I read historians who sit there and go, this period was all about successes for this nation, this period was all about successes for this nation. It wasn't. War is rarely one-sided, and very, very rarely does everything go one way? So the fact is, the Royal Navy managing to get Ram 1 is a good thing. If they got the rest, that would have been great, but they didn't. They managed to get to Japan, but then Japan has the problem of dealing with them. And it all comes down to logistics. Osprey 28. Now I'm thinking of a 90,000 ton, a 5,000 ton ship with a top speed of 36 knots, 15 15-inch guns. I'm not sure what you're building, but that sounds quite scary. Ben Groen and Dr. Clark. Are the Deutschland's turrets the same machinery as the Scharnhorst? Could it have been a poorly considered attempt at economies of scale or transport to a new hull, a la Japan? Not really. In fact, the machinery, the Scharnhorst ones are actually far better than the Deutschland's ones. And the Deutschland's, the Scharnhorst in many ways are successors of the Deutschland's ones. So, you know. So, Thompson, if Edinburgh hadn't have been restricted by the treaties in design, would she be radically different or just slightly larger? Would think they would be handy in the ocean. Well, that is pretty much what the town class were being built for. If there hadn't been... There is a very interesting design study of the town classes, which was obviously a theoretical design study, which has them all at about 12,000 tons. And you start to see what would have been the ideal cruiser if the Royal Navy had managed to build it. For starters, in one of those rather interesting scenarios, you have 5 treble turrets. 5 treble turrets. And rather than 4 quadruple turrets is what's being looked at, or 5 treble turrets for 6-inch guns. They prefer the 5 trebles over the 4 quadruples, because despite one getting you 16 guns, quadruple 6-inch guns are considered quite technically difficult, whereas they've got a very good working treble 6-inch gun, so they must well go with that. The debate was whether or not the 5th gun would go aft with X gun lowered down a position, so you'd have X, Y, Z. X, Y, Z. You'd have Z down sort of low, and then Y, and then X. So X would be level with B turret. Then Y would be level with A, and then Z would be on a level sort of lower. And they were considering it. There were all sorts of options for the town class to make them better, but they went with a fairly good design and they kept with it. But Edinburgh and Belfast were going to be the flagships of the China station. Is fairly sure what they were destined for. And you would have seen the China station, if war had held off for a couple more years, you would have probably seen the China station become all town class, or at least centered on about 3 to 4 town class. The East Indies centered on 3 to 4 town class, and they're both having a county as probably a station flagship. The Royal Navy didn't really want the town class weren't. How do I put this? A little bit more armor, it sounds lovely, but honestly, they'd be more interested in giving them slightly more subdivision and slightly more power and fuel for range. The extra guns were what they were looking at because those would have been quite useful for a lot more firepower. And that is quite critical at certain points. Fine. Back in a second, just off to wash my hands. January to March 1942. Right. For some reason, I have 1943 written up there, but I think it was 1942. Ah, well, I don't know. This is the problem with me handwriting notes. Mm-hmm. Suffolk Thompson, no crown colonies as well, or were they strictly war build? If Britain had, they started the crown colonies prior to World War II, but that was because they were starting to read the auspices and think war was coming. And they were thinking it was coming sooner, so they needed to start building a stripped down version for war, which was what the crown colonies were, the stripped down version of the town class. That meant that they were building them, but I think if they had if they had more time, probably you'd have seen more town class built, and then the crown colony started. There was always the crown colony design there. Sure, Mike. Without a third super firing turret, I see no reason to go with 15 6-inch guns over 12, and then just put the displacement for better layout range. You see, the reasoning behind 15 6-inch turret, 15 6-inch guns, really, was thinking about the options of if this ship was your scout reconnaissance surface radar, what did you need it to do? Where did you need it for? And if it's trying to run away, if it's got 3 turrets firing aft, then it can deal with 3 different enemy targets coming at it from the rear and keep blasting away at 3 of them. That was the idea. Reality, no. So, no, there's lots of design studies. There's always design studies. There are always things being looked at. And in this case, you have, and this is why I'm sure it is 1942, because you're Indomitable doing all sorts of stuff, which is in 1942. So, apologies to everyone. My note taking, although no one seems to notice that earlier. Right. Kido Batai fast attack Terracross first raided Darwin, which is always an interesting scenario because when they raid Darwin, the Australians are really not prepared, and you'd think they possibly would be. And then you have Ceylon. And the thing is, again, it's rather like Taranto. The Royal Navy launches the attack on Taranto not because they want to destroy the Italian fleet, although that would be a nice benefit, but because they're covering convoy movements. They've got an attack going into Genoa as well, carried out by Force H. They've got all sorts of things going on to distract the Italians while they move convoys around the ocean. This is again what the Japanese are doing. They're not really going, arguably, into the Indian Ocean hunting the Royal Navy. If they found the Royal Navy Task Force, that's great. But you can start to explain a lot of their actions once you consider they are literally going in as covering force. They are distracting the Royal Navy while they move a division. Because if that division had been intercepted, then the Japanese would have been in a lot of trouble. And it would have been problematic. Osprey 28, you could go with 2 wing turrets. You should have 21 Paul from Chicago. You should have 21 6-inch guns, so it will at least be rated and can have a post captain. Oh my, this is going to start. Did the Crown Colonies class try to do too much? Would they have been better off with either 3 triple turrets or 4 twin turrets? Dennis Freeman. 3 triple turrets is what they ended up with, most of them, and that worked out quite well. 4 triple turrets were always a best option, but if you want to save it, Paul from Chicago. Wait, I am an admin now. I have to be responsible and can't troll. Paul, we did go over this about the flotilla leaders and becoming admins in the group chat in the chat. Osprey 28. 3 forward superfiring, 3 rear superfiring, and 2 wing turrets per side, each with 3 guns. A 30-gun ship. That is probably some sort of battle cruiser at that point when it's got 36-inch guns. Ben Grung, question quickly, and I see something a common number too often for me to think about is why did so many ships seem to aim for 27 knots? King George V, Yamato, North Korea, Nagato. Okay. Right, if I'm going to answer a 27 knot question, I'm going to do this, and I'm back. Hello. So, 27 knots is about a sweet point in terms of horsepower and size and everything. The requirements to go far, if you want to go faster, let's say that's your speed and you want to reach this point, the power you require does that to go faster. There is always the classic example, which I think Drac used in a bilge pumps a while back on one of the dreadnoughts of the German Navy, which was designed to have a diesel-powered center screw, and ended up the diesel engine wasn't ready on time, and so they didn't fit an engine. They didn't fit the weight of the engine, or the screw, or the shaft, or the screw, or anything, and so she could still do roughly the same speed as her contemporaries, because of weight versus speed, weight versus power to make speed. So, and hull form. So that's why 27 knots is this sort of thing, because you're all talking about ships which are, yes, they are so weight, but a certain percentage of their hull, their displacement, has to be put over to machinery to power these things, and that what percentage you're prepared to put will dictate usually what speed you will get out of it. Daniel Freeman, we don't allow talk of wing turrets here. That's Admiral Fisher type crazy talk. Now, I think the Americans won over that if you count AA, maybe as high as first or second rates. If you count AA, some of the ships were carrying enough guns to mount more than first rates. I think there was one which is called a Chicago Piano, which had 16 40 millimeters of pom-pom with 16 guns. And if you've got 3 or 4 of those fitted, your numbers of guns are going to go up fairly dramatically quite quickly. It's some of the fun times. So Operation C, or the Easter Sunday Raid. And again, we're going to go into this in big, so bye-bye again for a second. I've so got to get us to do massive on a one click. So, I got this picture from the lovely people who I've put a link down in below. And really, April is about subs. USS Seawolf and HMS Truant do some very, very fun things. But here's the thing. Truant sinks the Yemur and the Shinsei Maru in the Straits of Malacca on the 1st of April. on the 1st of April. If we consider when what's coming, if that if those submarines had managed to be waiting around when the Japanese went back, there would have been a very different scenario coming in. There's also the fact that actually the Operation C, they don't come through the Straits of Malacca, but they do withdraw through the Straits of Malacca. And you have Ozawa's cruiser force, which is part of Operation C, who do all this sort of operations off the coast of India and cause so much trouble with the delivery of food and the movement of goods on the coast of India, also withdraw with the fleet. But you've basically got the Japanese are divided in two. This is the interesting thing. The Japanese forces are largely divided in two. You have cruisers coming out from Malaysia, Burma-ish area. And you have the carriers coming through the Sunda Strait from memory, up the south coast of Sumatra, and heading towards Ceylon. But again, if you look where they're heading for, they go south, then they go round, and actually, when they launched their strike at Devonshire and Cornwall, if Devonshire and Cornwall had been going where they were supposed to go and not been called down by Somerville, interesting enough, though, is that the 18th Division, is delivered to Rangoon as part of Operation U, which is fairly critical. 56th Division is also delivered on the this time, and this all is to cover Japanese troop movements. The whole of Operation C is about covering Japanese troop movements. If the Royal Navy had been threatening them, Jeff Beeler, was HMS Hermes ever considered for an all-fighter group? Yes, she was. In fact, I think at one point she was mounting an all-fighter group of gladiators, but in the end, usually she was better as a cruiser carrier, and as a cruiser carrier, what she really needed wasn't fighters, it was swordfish, or their equivalents. Paul Chicago. I believe the 4 and 8 barrel versions were both referred to as Chicago pianos. Then what were it's always interesting because there is a 16 one, and I've seen it labeled as Chicago piano in the UK and grand piano, and I always thought Chicago pianos were what I think the 8 barrel ones are more Chicago pianos, but I'm not sure what the 16 barrel ones are. Mm-hmm. Jeff Beeler, why was HMS Hermes still in Ceylon on the 9th and not running west? Servicing those sort of issues. It's to do with maintenance. It's to do with basically getting the ship ready for sea. But honestly, she should have been. And if you consider when Dorsetshire and Cornwall are sunk, it's one of those things. It is just the British have some great systems there and could have achieved a lot if they'd managed to achieve some sort of coordinated command. It's like Malaya almost all over again, Operation C, and had a British. And the thing is, after this, Somerville gets back to his strength very quickly. It sort of shocks him back into Somerville. And as I've said before, to extend his defense, he's been fighting a war non-stop, and he's been sent out there. He's been asked to do all sorts of things. He was a man who'd been pensioned off first off because he was ill and then brought back. And the Indian Ocean, he knows well. He knows it really, really well. As I said, he has been a former CNC East Indies. He knows that ocean. He's served in it several times before in his career. He is definitely, on paper, one of the admirals you go and pick. If you're looking at just that paper. Me, if I'd been looking at the fact of his service record on all the stress he's been covering, I'd have probably gone for someone else. Because You need a Somerville with the fire in his belly at the beginning of World War II. You don't need a Somerville of what's there in 1942. Jeff Beeler, the 1.1-inch quad was the original Chicago piano. Chicago piano, at least to me, always meant 20mm of the gun, not necessarily the mounting. There are lots of options for it. Anyway, right. So the I-30. The I-30. This is one of those stories which I think is here. Imagine if this had got to Japan. Thank goodness for Rear Admiral Hoshina Zenitsujo. Because if he hadn't got what he'd done at Penang, then the whole of Monsoon Group wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked. Oh, sorry. I thought it was rain outside or thunder outside, and actually it's just someone on their skateboard. It's, it's a constant thing. The impact of all this technology on the Japanese, if it arrived, would have been massive. And it would have been really, really useful for the Japanese Navy to get access to it because they'd given so much technology to the Germans. And it had gone both ways. The information had gone both ways. And it was very much sharing. Jeff Vila, how much of did the Kido Batai's actions shell-shock the RN given that they had never faced like before? Honestly, it didn't. You see, the thing is, yes, there are penny packets of the Royal Navy which are taken out. There's Dorsetshire, there's Cornwall, there's Hermes, there's her escort, which are lost, which includes a brilliant Australian destroyer. All these things are lost, and yes, that's a, but to be honest, the Royal Navy could lose a couple of cruisers, a small carrier, and some destroyers in the average Mediterranean run. The Royal Navy is used to facing the combined air masses that are thrown at them by the Germans and the Italians in the Mediterranean. They are used to fighting a major air war. Yes, having it carrier-based is slightly novel, but it's nothing they also themselves hadn't been considering and working out in the interwar years because they had been practicing massed carrier tactics in the interwar years. They'd practiced carrier cooperation. The fact that they weren't getting to do it that often because of the needs of war and having spread their ships out, it's neither here nor there. They worked it all out. So they weren't having shell shock of the Kido Batai. In some respects, there was shell shock at their own actions and their actions in the face of the Kido Batai and how Somerville had reacted to it. Because he was expected to do better than he did. And I think he expected himself to do better than he did. Thomas Rottweiler, I-30 must have been a large submarine to fit 220mm air guns, or was that just barrels? That was just the barrels. But remember, they had taken out over 2 tons of raw materials. Dr. Freeman, Dr. Clark, would the Japanese have had the industrial capacity to make use of the contents of I-30 in anything like a timely fashion? The sheer amount of materials they were getting, I think they would have managed to do something. I'm not sure how many radars they could have generated or how many things they could have, but they already had their own ideas working on these things. So honestly, what I see it would be information being used and the stuff gained from these facilities used to refine their existing models, which are already in production, or starting to begin production, to make them better when they enter service. And that's what I see it as doing. It would have been an accelerator. Ian Carr, when would the first Sea Lord have last seen Somerville face to face? Dunkirk, probably. Dunkirk. After Dunkirk, before he was sent out to Force H. So that's how long since he's been home, pretty much. Going on. What is your assessment of Somerville? My assessment is he was a good admiral. And honestly, this was probably the war that would have made most sense to him. Doing what he did to the French and other things he was ordered to were not tasteful to him. He wasn't really that kind of operator. But fighting the Japanese, that was something he'd studied for and he knew and he'd worked for. But he was. By 1942, he'd been involved in the war since 1939, when he'd come back after being ill. He'd come back on the condition of doing light duties. Those light duties had been first helping out with the 3rd Sea Lord office, then going down to help out with Dunkirk. Then he had been sent out to run Force H. So those aren't really light duties. And then he's now out in the Indian Ocean. So he's done Dunkirk, Force H, and actually he comes back staff duties. He's working on radar. He's one of the Royal Navy's top radar experts and communications experts, and that's what he comes in to help with getting the 3rd Sea Lord getting himself. So he comes back for what is a desk job. Then he gets transferred for a temporary desk assignment to help out Ramsay at Dunkirk. Okay? So he's sent down there as a temporary extra admiral down there, because Ramsay can't do it all on his own. And then he's rewarded with Force H, possibly one of the most tasking, emotionally, mentally challenging posts in World War II. You're either Cunningham or you're not, in the nicest way, for the Mediterranean. And then it's the Indian Ocean. This is a man. He needs time. He needs time to recover from that before he's really ready to fight this. And in many ways, actually, the shock of Operation C shocks him back into his prior state. But by the end of his time at Force H and before he came up, he had been so worn down. He wasn't the Somerville of the high energy, the hard working at the beginning of the war. And then Operation C happens and he's sort of in a malaise. He's not really doing what he does. Mm-hmm. And Daniel Freeman, an I-30 wasn't carrying any. An I-30 wasn't carrying any footing on Bofors. Nope, no, unfortunately. In car subs other than I-30 did make the trip to Europe successfully. They did, and they did make it back as well. But the thing is, I-30's the first and would have got it there earliest. The most likely chance for actually having success and being able to implement these things is earlier on. So the first one matters. JMF, by 1943, Somerville was something of a spent force as a strike commander. That is the problem. Well, from Chicago, it sounds like less like tired and more like exhausted. Mentally and physically is what I would erase him as. But that doesn't mean he's excused for making bad decisions. It's the reason he was making them. Paul, Dr. Clark, the IJN had aviators like Fushida and Grenda influencing decision making. Did the FAA have equivalents? Yes. The FAA had all sorts of very, very good aviators going through and observers going up. They'd had Henderson putting forward the carriers. They had Lumley Lister developing a lot of the strategies and pushing them forward at very senior ranks. You have all sorts of forces going out. You have lots of very capable young officers coming through at this time. And honestly, they could have sent in more forces. Yes, they didn't think they needed to. Well, they were trying to slowly build up in Indian Ocean. But I have a feeling if he had taken proper account of what was coming his way, he could have had another carry-on route to join him. And well, the interesting thing is Somerville had been there for an exercise in the Mediterranean in the interwar period, where my reading of it is, and this is slightly controversial reading, is that the Royal Navy used spoof radio signals to lure an enemy fleet to their carriers, and they lure them into strike range of the carriers. And he was the comms guy on that side in that exercise. So if anyone's going to think about it like that, it's going to be Somerville. Somerville is, in World War One, he is the comms officer par excellence. He is an officer who's come up as a communications and electronics specialist. Very rare for them to get to senior rank, especially not as the rank he's got to. So, and he has proved very good operationally. So the fact that he doesn't do anything like that to try and confuse the Japanese, but instead is concentrating on silence, and gathering his fleet to him, it's him not at his best by any way, shape, or form. Sure, Mac. I think it's similar to Halsey. He needed a break, and Halsey got it to an extent, but he got nothing. Yeah, and that's the thing. 1943 becomes an anti-submarine war, an air war, and you have these sort of afterwards. You have the sort of the Kriegsmarine establishing a submarine base at Penang, which is just amazing. The Kriegsmarine get involved. The Kriegsmarine really do get involved in the Indian Ocean in the fight going on there. And the 10th Air Force getting involved as well. And that's, of course, the American Liberator bombers doing all sorts of damage. And you have raids being launched on Penang. Anyway, go back to the questions. Paul, does anyone think that Somerville was affected mentally by Mirza Kabir and killing sailors that he'd been serving alongside a few weeks earlier? Yeah, he was. It was very distasteful to him. You needed someone with a killer instinct to take the burden of that job, and I don't think Somerville had that sort of killer instinct. He did have a killer instinct, and he could be used in fighting the enemy was one thing, but doing Mirza Kabir requires an officer who has a latitude of personality in a way, and can understand, can consider the strategic reasons, and can do it. In the nicest way, you either needed Cunningham, who, remember, dealt with the French forces in Alexandria by not informing them what was going on and then pointing guns at them. And you could have had Vian. Unfortunately, he's too junior at this point, but Vian certainly would have done it. Fraser would have done it. Casper John. Horton. There are lots of officers who would have done it without even a second's hesitation, I can think of, and wouldn't have worried about afterwards. They'd have seen it as necessary for the war effort. But Somerville was not one of them. For Somerville, that took a toll. Daniel Freeman, at 2 o'clock. Risk of incurring the wrath of bilge pumps. Did the RN need to close the South China Sea with submarines and mines to keep the IJN in a pre-Indian Ocean raid? Yes, they should have done that. The mines were quite successful, as you can see. I-30 got sunk. Paul from Chicago sounds more like he was ill entering into the war and things got worse for Somerville. Yes. God Eagle, what about Roger Keyes in Mozambique? He wouldn't have even bothered. Roger Keyes wouldn't have given a flying hoot. Yeah, that would have been a very quick. And honestly, Somerville, you can place some of the failures of Mozambique at Somerville's distaste for doing it. If he'd gone more offensive doing it and more aggressive, then the French would have been really scuppered. Ian Carr, USN Sea Admirals, took one operation on, one off to allow planning. Somerville and Cunningham got none of this through 3 years. Nope, they didn't. And the problem is the Royal Navy is short of officers and short of senior officers at this point because, as I've said before, some died prior to World War II, which were a loss, and they needed to expand more to deal with the World War II, which is, again, makes the point when you have officers who are retiring in 1942 and all these things, it's kind of a mockery. If you were any good, you wouldn't be allowed to retire. Paul Johnson, it's o'clock. Would the Kriegsmarine have been better concentrating on the Atlantic and Arctic rather than moving into the Far East? Well, that's the difference. The question is, how much would that deployment have actually, those resources actually been deployed to the far, deployed there, have actually helped the Atlantic, considering how many were actually deployed there? It's not a lot. It causes an outside impact on British forces, as the Japanese, etc., needed most of their submarines to fight the Americans, so they were never going to have a major submarine presence in the Indian Ocean, although they often did have a submarine presence there, and they'd deploy a few boats, but not as many as they sort of were facing off against the Americans with. And it does have an impact in terms of the British have to send escorts, they have to send things out to the Indian Ocean to secure it. But they would have had a fleet out there anyway to fight the Japanese, so honestly, it's half a dozen one and 6 the other. That's it. It's half a dozen one and 6 the other. Shomak, there are officers that would have worked for it, and officers that wouldn't. Like the US, I think Halsey could have done it, Spruance maybe, but I don't think Fletcher could have done it. That's your issues. Would Sifrit have been a possible substitute as he was available in theatre by 1942-3? Yes, he would have been, and frankly, he would have been a good substitute. Sifrit was a very good commander of carriers. Golden Eagle, can you do an assessment of Dudley Pound? Not really. He's not really relevant to the Indian Ocean. I'll chat about Dudley Pound another time. But, that's more Battle of the Atlantic question. So, Dr. Clark, seems retention has been an issue since the 1800s, i.e., lack of prize shares compensation, along with the introduction of the income tax, have anything to do with it? I think prize money might have kept them in. Prize money would have certainly kept them in, but no. And prize money from World War II would have been significant. The Royal Navy was scooping up prizes left, right, and centre. Paul from Chicago. Mers El Kabir is on a scale with Pearl Harbor, made worse by the fact the French Air Force had demilitarized and the ships weren't allowed to go to put to sea before being fired on. Yeah, so what? I'm sorry, I have a lot of sympathy for the French and Mers El Kabir, but I understand the British position, and it's a very simple logic. You guys have just capitulated to the Germans by having negotiations behind our back without telling us. How can we trust your promise that you won't hand your fleet over to the Germans, or maybe even provide support for the Germans with you in the ships yourselves? We can't. We can't trust you. So, you are given an option. take your fleet to a neutral harbour and sit out the rest of the war. We were quite happy to escort you to the United States or anywhere like that. Or be sunk. Yes, it's brutal. Yes, there are allies. Yes, you're going to kill friends. But you're talking about the survival of Britain in terms of from what the British government and the Royal Navy is thinking. Because if you combine the French fleet with the German fleet and the Italian fleet, you suddenly have a very different situation than if you're facing off against the Germans and the Italians, because the French fleet is another force. It's another capable group. Yes, it's another logistics thing for them to support, but it's another problem. We've got enough that you're dealing with as it is now without having that become another problem. And it also tells the Americans and the rest of the world that Britain's not out of the fight, that Britain isn't going to give in. So it's a useful global signal as well as a useful necessity. Daniel Phillips, what would have happened to Prince of Wales and Repulse if they survived the fall of Malaya? How much of a difference would they have made to Somerville's force? If they had withdrawn on Somerville's force, that would have given Somerville a lot stronger formation, but it also wouldn't have been Somerville in command. If they survived, Phillips would still be in command. Somerville might be resting. Sifrit would have been sent out probably as carrier commander, because that's what he would have been probably been sent out anyway as. And you would have probably had, with Phillips there, having had to withdraw his battleships in the face of heavy air attack, would have probably called up air support. You might have also had an interesting different option end up at Singapore, because you might have found battleships sitting in Singapore, because let's be honest, even if they had got away, the odds are one of them would have got away injured. So let's say Repulse is injured. She would have been sitting in Singapore with a whole load of high explosive for 15-inch, as well as her own armor-piercing shells and 15-inch guns, and that could have been very interesting for the Japanese attack on Singapore. It might have actually provided them with enough firepower to make up for their dismal ground leadership. Considranus, US developed a coastal defense system after the French surrender because of their fleet falling into German hands. Yeah. So Thompson, Stafford Thompson, the frogs were lucky the lobsters talked first and didn't come in blazing like Drake or Nelson. That is the interesting thing. If you consider how other officers handled it, Somerville is particularly polite at Mirza Kibir. Paul, at Dr. Clark, they never attacked Toulon. The UK seemed to assume the surviving French units wouldn't retaliate. Maybe. Or maybe there's usually a submarine sitting outside Toulon's entrance. Or they decided Toulon was too high a risk to go into an attack when they had other options, priorities. Because let's be honest, when you're in Toulon, you're in a war zone already. Where on Mirza Kabir, you are straight out into the Atlantic. Jabila, boy, things get quiet after Madagascar, except for the Australian 9th Division coming home. To be honest, a lot doesn't happen because, again, you have Somerville worrying all the time about the Kido Batai coming back into the Indian Ocean, and having to strengthen his forces for that. You have Operation Ironclad, you have all sorts of things happening up in Burma, and the Royal Navy doing strikes. The carriers are being used for mounting strikes and doing all sorts of operations to try and help and assist the army ashore and distract the Japanese and attack their positions. But honestly, you have no really telling commander to push it forward. Sure, Mac, I was talking about Mexico. I don't think Fletcher could have done it. He seems too nice a guy. Halsey could have done it, though. Yep. Stephen Wilson, check out Drax's video on Mesocareer. It is a good video. Jeff Beeler, if Philip survived, would he have stayed in command without Prince of Wales and Repulse? If he lost both his ships but somehow survived, it's potential he would have been left in command, but he'd probably have been invalided home, or would have been put in a land place and had a sea commander sent out. Danny Freeman, I think the problem in Mesocareer was snobbery on the part of the French admiral, who also probably underestimated British determination. There's all sorts of things. Stanley, Stafford Thompson, that makes a lot more sense than the 14-ton 500. Thank you, Stafford. Golden Eagle did suggest up there John Tovey, and I didn't talk about him as a potential commander to do. Well, I will talk about Dudley Patton and John Tovey in terms of their concept of Mirza Kabir. Dudley Pound does have a ruthless streak in him, and I think probably could have done it. Tovey's a nice guy. Tovey is a nice guy. I'm not sure. I think if they'd thought he would have reliably done it, he might have been sent instead of Somerville. And he wasn't. Stephen Wilson, I don't think there is another one where Drac is so angry over that French admiral. It is something, and it's going to sound strange. Actually, we have talked about Mirza Kabir before. It's before a build trumps, because sometimes what happens with build trumps, because Jamie's in Australia and Drac and I are in the UK, we sometimes are chatting and then Jamie joins us, or sometimes Jamie gets there and I'm running late and Jamie and Drac chatting. So sometimes Mirza Kabir is a subject he and I are both. The blame for what happens is mostly the French, but also we sit there and Somerville could have done his job that much better. In Car, Bonham Carter had a reputation for every ship under him sinking. Could he have been loaned to the French? Honestly, I'm surprised we didn't offer him to the Germans. I think to an extent, the French admiral and the French governor at Mirza Kabir couldn't understand where the British were coming from. To their perspective, The war was over. The British were going to reach a peace agreement with the Germans very shortly, and there was no point worrying about it. There would be no need for the British to do it because the British were going to acquiesce to German demands because the French were out of the war. So why would the British keep fighting? How would the British keep fighting without the French in the war? And one of the interesting things is when you often do think when you're looking at Mussolini and his decision to enter the war in June 1940, is the reason he's entering then, even though his forces aren't really prepared even at all for it. It's because he's worried the war's going to be over soon. Because he and the French, he's listening to the French, he's talking and looking at all these things. He's worried that the British are going to capitulate and he will get none of the glory. And actually, what they end up finding is the British keep going. And the British aren't supposed to keep going. They do, but they're not supposed to. So that's part of the thing. But also, part of the trouble with keeping going is you've got people like Somerville who have been called back, but perhaps shouldn't have been called back. Jenworth, Toby knew the land, lay of the land where the Merzel Kabir was concerned, and having been 2IC or Force H, he would have probably done the same thing that Cunning did. Possibly. Cunning. The French really haven't been paying attention to British foreign policy for the past 5 centuries. No, it always shocks people when they realise the British have a consistent foreign policy. It's one of those interesting things. We have a consistent foreign policy, but you have to. It never gets enunciated. But there is a consistent foreign policy which carries on through British actions. Van to be fair, had guys like Halifax gotten their way, the war would have been over. That's always a suggestion. Ian Carr, would it have been different if Somerville had personally gone ashore to negotiate a Merzel Kabir? Potentially, but unlikely. They might have thought he was bluffing. And again, if he goes ashore, that gives them time to prepare and these sort of things. I don't think it's a really smart move. Paul, have a look up and see what the second BF got up to. They did actually do quite a lot of fighting, and there was actually even more landings after that. There were technically 3, well, definitely 2 major ones, and a third one sort of extractions from France. And the British did keep coming back. They just had the problem that the French were negotiating even as the first BF was being withdrawn. Shomak, I think Halsey would have been in a similar position as Somerville if Nitz wasn't in position where he could have relieve him before Midway. Yes, I think I like the American system where they do relieve commanders. The British system is just go to war. There's even at one point where Vian basically collapses and is dragged back to war about a month later. He's given a month's convalescence and then gone. And you've got the classic example of Wake Walker, who is just. It is some of the things that they get up to. Daniel Freeman, I suspect so, although he sent the fluent French speaker who had just come from being the naval attaché in Paris before taking up command of a major fleet unit. It was very sensible. And we are now on to a Yes Minister discussion, and of course, I have to agree. But I do like the fact that one of the most foremost naval commentators in the UK hides behind the Sir Humphrey Monacum. Ben Grogan, Dr. Clark, you've previously suggested that early Lancaster in the Atlantic would have made a huge effect on convoys. How many for Atlantic and how many in India do you think to be noticed? For the Atlantic, you probably want a wing operating out of Canada, a wing operating out of Iceland once you take there, and a couple of wings operating out of Scotland and Northern Ireland. And for India, you probably be Indian Ocean, you're probably looking at about another 4 wings as well. So you probably talk about 8 wings of aircraft. So about 300 odd Lancasters to support them all. 150 for each, 160 preferably. That's a huge number of aircraft. You must remember, though, that the RAF were planning on building up to 1,000 bomber raids, which would not be their entire bomber strength going. Wow, that's a large horse. It's not really in the scale of World War II. When you're talking about that, you'd be talking probably the ones based in Canada would be Royal Canadian Air Force. Iceland, probably Royal Air Force. UK, probably Royal Air Force. The ones in the Indian Ocean to cover that area. Perhaps Royal Indian Air Force as well as Royal Air Force. You need a lot. Paul, Jen Saul wasn't authorized to negotiate. He didn't have comms with Darlin and just knew the armistice required him that he had to disarm while denying his ships to the British. An impossible position. Yep. So in 1943, the main attack force is the US Air Force's 10th Air Force. No Castle Command or RN subs. There are RN subs going on doing operations, but they are sinking some ships. There are lots of German subs doing operations, but mainly it's the carriers doing strikes, and there's very limited coastal command out there. There's very limited anything really out there, and it's not helped by the organization that's available. So Louis Mountbatten ends up putting in an organization where you have an Air Chief Marshal as the senior Air Force commander, commanding everything, of course, but then you have operational command. It's all combined under the general in charge of 10th Air Force, because Louis Mountbatten looks at his Air Chief Marshal and thinks, you are one of the biggest I have ever met in my entire life. Where has an otherwise decent air service managed to generate you from? What in the name of all things holy did you do to get to your rank? And uses the American as the coordinator for the Air Force, and they start doing a lot of work, but the 10th are the major part of it. Ian Card, a toll on senior naval staff before and during World War II suggests many were overworked. Was there insufficient delegation or measures? Henderson basically works himself to death with 18-hour days for about 6 years. That's similar of many senior officers prior to World War II. Pretty much you've got the old system that Britain always has this thing where you will have the papers ready to print numbers about the Royal Navy on the British Armed Forces having too many senior officers. Because in their world, all the senior officer does is sit behind a desk and smile. Senior officers actually tend to work fairly hard, and if you don't have a large enough mass of them, you can't replace or swap out as the Americans were doing. The Americans basically maintain a dual command system, and they top in one and replace the other. if you said to the British prior to World War II, you want to generate this, the Royal Navy would have had to, I don't know, probably double its number of rear admirals in 1935 to be able to stand a chance of having officers not only with enough rank and enough experience, but able trained up to do the role. Sure, Mac. To have the ability to relieve officers the way Nimitz did, you need someone who is like a Nimitz guy. Nimitz, a guy with very good people skills, but also practical enough to do it. Look at what Cunningham was doing in Mediterranean. Cunningham was always swapping out senior officers, but he could do that on a lower level. To an extent, it's what Pound tried to do in the North Sea and in with the Arctic and various other things. But Britain has so many, and as I said, doesn't have enough senior officers to really do it properly. They sort of do it in the Pacific Fleet a bit when Sifret gets replaced by Vian, but yeah, then Vian just becomes king of as far as he's concerned of the Pacific Fleet. Danny Freeman, I think it's the difference between being at sea leading as opposed to commanding from either behind the lines or an Air Force bunker. Complete exhaustion. You don't get any time off when you're at sea. You're constantly able to be called. You do that to an extent on the land side as well, but you, to an extent, you have more security. Sure, Matt, King wanted to end Fletcher's command after Coral Sea, and Nimitz dreaded doing that, but he would have done it if Fletcher was what King thought he was. Possibly. Jeffy, the 10th used B-17s for naval strike from the beginning. Must have shocked the Japanese. They were very useful. They use B-17s and they also use B-24s. And the 10th was a fairly good air force, a fairly good formation. And in fact, they preferred operating to an extent under British command than they did when they had to operate under a certain general from their own nation. Carl Davidson, another admiral who worked himself to death was Admiral John McCain, who died within 1 week of the end of the war. Jeff Ealer, the RN can transfer rather than remove. The USN has fewer senior operations posts. Pretty much that's what the RN has to do, but it's not really that greater option, because if you look at it, you've got Somerville really should have been withdrawn to a land post for about a year back in the UK to rest up. And even then, he wouldn't have been rested because he'd been working 16 to 18-hour days, but they might have forced him to take a couple of weekends off. Spend some time with the family. Play with a dog. Something like that. Going on, the Japanese Navy song comes to mind. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The Navy has no weekends. That does make sense. And that is the thing. There is no... If you consider, if you're an army officer, if you're in North Africa, then you've got fighting going on. But if you're back in the UK and there's no invasion, you're training, prepping, but it's not immediate. There is fighting going on, but the officers, they have downtime. If you're an Air Force officer, especially senior command, you're planning, you're organizing these things, but you're not running the battle fleet in the middle of the night. You're not running the fight. You might be, but it's very unlikely you would be, unless you're Dowding. He's about the only one who is. And then you have all sorts of issues going on. In Navy, you're at sea, you're in charge 24/7. Doesn't matter if you're asleep or awake. You can be woken up at any time because there's something happening. Sure, Mac. Daniel Freeman. That's why I think Spruance was successful as a commander, because he found a way to balance getting stuff done and doing what he needed to do to take care of himself. Arguably, yes. Jeff Ealer, nobody liked working with Stilwell, not just the 10th. It wasn't just Stilwell they had trouble with. MacArthur was also someone they had a great dislike with running. This will finish tonight at about 9:30, okay? Just giving people about a 29-minute heads up. Ben Grogan, the British made approaches with the specific orders in mind, didn't they? Disallow to any enemy. We, the enemy, will take or sink you. Move to neutral ports to prevent counter. Pretty much, it was a very straightforward thing at Mirza Kabir. Andrew Reynolds, did the Japanese rotate their admirals? No, not really. The Japanese version of rotation was them getting killed and so getting promoted. Jeff Beeler, Spruance indeed sees more sea duty than any other US admiral. Probably why Nimitz starts alternating him with Halsey. Yeah. Daniel Freeman, don't know enough about the personalities of American commanders except for Patton and MacArthur, really. Let's be honest. Honestly, out of the American generals, they're not the worst ones. There are worse. They are some of the most known personalities, but are not the worst. Brock Payne, Spruance also got semi-retired at one point after Guadalcanal. However, King took a dislike to him. King takes a dislike to many people. If basically, I sometimes consider it a good thing. If King dislikes someone, then they're probably half decent. Sure, mate. Jeff Beeler, Stilwell is like MacArthur, except more full of himself, and like MacArthur, was totally useless. Yeah. There are a lot of issues with Stilwell. A lot. It's one of those fun things. There are issues with, there's issues with the Indian Ocean the whole time because the Indian Ocean is one of those areas where people are talking. When they talk about World War II, think about it from your own book collections, your own memories to movies about World War II. The way people talk about it in proper memory. People remember Northern Europe. They remember the Battle of the Atlantic. They remember the Pacific Island hopping campaign and the huge battles of the Pacific. They remember the Battle of the River Plate down in the South Atlantic. They might remember the Burma campaign. How often do you hear about the Indian Ocean? And the trouble is, as important as it was, you're not hearing about it, but also that means the officers you get sent out there and sometimes who will go out there might well not. Those ones stick in the mind because those are the really big, preeminent campaigns that they are going to pick their absolute best for. The ones who go out to the Indian Ocean, well, if you're sending Lord Louis Mountbatten as your supreme commander, that shows you how short you are as supreme commanding material. I'm sorry. I know I have a downer on Louis, but oh no. Just no. Mark Clark was horrendous. Still, gives Brock Payne is a good lecture I listened to about Spruance and how he gets kicked to the curb in a way. Yeah, I think I'm going to do more of the Admiral series at some point, and I'm going to look at Spruance, Nimitz, and the US Command in the Pacific, and the Japanese Command in the Pacific, because I think that'd be quite an interesting thing to look at for the Admirals, engineers, and historians. Jeff Ealer, Stilwell wasn't useless, but too crotchety to be really effective. He was well thought of by his superiors. No. Daniel Freeman, Genesol only had two options, scuttle or fight, in line with the arms restrictions. His hands were tied moving to a neutral port, would have allowed Germany to occupy all of France. That's what he certainly feared. But that would have required a lot of troops for Germany to do, and they were planning on invading Russia. Rob Payne, from what I've heard, Stillwell got bogged down playing battalion commander in Burma when the Japanese were stomping all over the nationalist Chinese. He gets into issues. Tromac, Godning, he strikes me as a good organizer, someone I want on my staff, but never in charge of large forces and never dealing with allies. Ooh. He certainly has fun with Slim. Godning, also the allies in the Indian Ocean are far more diverse in terms of cultures than compared to the Western Front. Yes and no. Command cultures, mostly it's British, honestly, out there. Mostly the command culture is British in the Indian Ocean, and frankly, that's where the problem is. Vision, Admiral King's Order. My father is the most balanced man in the world. He is always angry. I like it, but I think that's a myth, but, it's a nice one. Thomas Ryder, what part did islands like Seychelles and Mauritius play in the war in the Indian Ocean? They were critical for some of the anti-submarine warfare efforts and some of the aircraft efforts. So most of those islands... Jeff Wheeler, nobody mentions the invasion of Reunion in 1941 by one Free French destroyer. Well, no, we didn't, because it's one Free French destroyer. I do remember it, but, Gustranis, I take pretty much anybody over the Dutch High Command with SEC. Yes, Southeast Asian Command, Dutch High Command, there is pretty much anyone could have done better. They weren't used to it. Strub, Doctor, have there been any army commanders who use the naval forces more effectively, i.e. than admirals? Making me have to scratch my head and remember a name here, but there was actually a very good one, and I think I know his name, and I think I know what it was. But I'm going to check it up. Colonel of the Sea. General at Sea, highest rank of the Navy under them, and Robert Blake. Yeah. Blake. Popham did quite well as well, but Monk was fairly good, but Blake and Monk are probably the two. But they are English civil or British. They are the Wars of the Wars of the Kingdoms era. Vision, so much of history is forgotten history to the general public. Opportunity for TV and YouTube historians. It is fun. Ian Carr, did the RN think they were sending Somerville somewhere quieter into the Indian Ocean when you look at the capital ships he was given? No, because this was after the destruction of 4C. Prior to 4C being lost, you could have argued the Indian Ocean was a quieter deployment. In fact, it's almost a case of why wasn't Somerville sent out as 4C's commander rather than Phillips? And that's a really interesting scenario because considering how cautious Somerville was, he would have probably based his forces back in Ceylon. But he was also used to the pre-war scenario of how you use battleships and how you conduct deterrence in the Far East. So that's another reason he would have probably ended up at Ceylon. Carl Harmon, I'm back. I'm sorry I left. No, don't worry. Neil, Atlantic Western Front was dominated by Anglo-Saxons, but Indian Ocean, you had Indian South. You have more of a mixture, certainly, but those forces are all trained to work to each other and all trained to the same standards. They're all very good soldiers, especially by the time you get into World War. By the time you're getting to the point that they're doing offensive operations and fighting alongside each other, and frankly, it works. Yes, there is a mixture, of cultures, but that doesn't make a problem. They are fair. They are very efficient. and they work well together and provide a fine fighting force. And it takes longer maybe to get them to work longer to get up there, but that's mainly because those forces have been more recently raised than the forces fighting in the West. Remember, most of this scenario is that the BEF had drawn largely from the troops which had been the pre-war army, or army of sort of Britain and these sort of things. And so the Commonwealth forces had been moved to take over the positions which those forces had been drawn from. And then new Commonwealth forces had to be raised. And honestly, it's usually the new Commonwealth forces which end up fighting in places like Southeast Asia, because there's already whatever existing units were probably taken off to fight in Iran and Iraq and all the other operations going on. That's the thing. Britain doesn't actually stabilize and start fortifying its positions in Southeast Asia because it's off dealing with invading retaking British Somaliland and dealing with the Italian Somaliland. It's off invading Iran and Iraq to deal with regimes there which might be pro-German and avoid an Ottoman scenario taking place in the Gulf. They are doing all these things. It's not about the cultures so much as the newness of the troops. JP, Spruance returns after the carrier admirals get too many carriers lost or heavily damaged. He and Fletcher conserve ships. To an extent. Come on. Which were the largest navies in the Indian Ocean campaign? Royal Navy. Royal Navy. Royal Navy. For most of the period. Especially after Operation C, they start forming up. Remember, most of the British Pacific Fleet is actually the British Indian Ocean Fleet. The moment you start beating, you've beaten the moment the Italians surrender, the British start sending heavy major units out to the Indian Ocean and out to really grow that. And even before that, that's quite a major force. Daniel Freeman, Golding, apart from the Indians in Italy, in Italy and the Free French, they're pretty much wherever the British go, the Commonwealth is part of it. There's always some Commonwealth troops. Paul, the French Navy did, Free French Navy did that off their own back, pissing off the US who had reached an accommodation with the Vichy governor. Free French, de Gaulle. Oh God, de Gaulle. I'm trying to avoid getting into the Free French. I don't want to spend my entire time arguing about de Gaulle and how big annoyance he was and whether or not he was the most annoying general in the whole of World War II or person with the rank of general. Because arguably he is. Shomack, Clark, it's about 9 months too late to get all the views for it, but it would be fun to do one of those tier lists that everyone was doing for admirals during the different wars. Tempting. Carl Harmon, how can we have 400 subs and always 60 watching? Just wondering. I have no idea. I'd like if we could get some more subscribers, we might get more people watching. And I do some stuff on Twitter, etc. about it. I would like more watching. It would be fun. I like the ones I have. You're all very nice. I don't want to lose any of you. You're all good, interesting questions. I didn't mind just being slightly more of you. Mainly from the point of view of, ooh, new name. Which is just fun sometimes to see. Strub, during the American Revolution, Benedict Arnold built a navy on Lake Champlain to delay British invasion. Now he lost, but he delayed the British until the next year. Battle of Saratoga. Interesting. Go on. Brooke Payne, good use of a navy by an army officer just with wee little boats. I think you're talking about George Washington. Sean Mack. Ooh, the unfocused live stream style isn't for anyone. It's the question and answer style. I have the videos for the people who prefer the videos, straight up videos, but I like to have all sort of live stream discussions. Because I like having the question and answer session, because I think we do cover the topic and broadly stick to the Indian Ocean or whatever the topic is of the day. But we also have the fun of answering some random questions and bringing something in context. And that's the thing. I see the live streams. That's what's changed. The recorded videos are lectures. They are me delivering information on a specific topic. Live streams are seminars when you are delivering information on that topic, but you're also bringing in all the context. So you respond to the questions when relevant. You turn the questions into something which is relevant. It's part of the academic style, and it's just as important because some students learn better with a lecture, some learn better with a seminar, some find one more interesting, some find the other more interesting. And honestly, I find it as a complete way. I don't feel complete about something if I've just done a lecture or if I've just done a seminar. I feel it's more complete if I've done both, which is why I love doing these lives, because they are the way I feel completed, that I have completed the delivery of this topic. Which sounds very egotistical, so please excuse that one. Come on. Very true, but I like it this way, as Dr. Clark does a very good job. It's Drac and Dr. Clark who helped foster my interest in naval history. I'm glad. Thank you. Geopolitics. Indian Ocean saw small Free French, Dutch units in the Saratoga strike force, but otherwise Commonwealth all the way. Brooks, Payne. A joke. Churchill's aide. Our problem is that de Gaulle believes he is Joan of Arc. Churchill, our problem is that my bishops won't let me burn him. That would not surprise me if it was true. Paul, I read a certain idea of France that the life of Charles de Gaulle over the lockdown. It's brilliant. De Gaulle was brilliant. De Gaulle is brilliant if you are a certain style of Frenchman. If you are trying to coordinate a war with multiple allies, having one of the smaller powers involved, and let's be honest, the Free French were one of the smaller groups, keep trying to act like they are the major power who can tell everyone what to do, and when they don't, go and have a strop in the corner or go off and do something random without telling everyone else, is blooming annoying. Basically, de Gaulle is lovely from one perspective. From another perspective, he's an absolute PTA. No, I forgot the I. The PITA. He's a pitter. Bad home. Were the Crown cruisers mostly used in the Ocean and Pacific? I never seem to be able to find much about the service history in Europe. They get used all over the place. If you look at the Battle of North Cape, if you look at the Mediterranean, they get everywhere. The Crown colonies are really, really used. HMS Bermuda is always going all sorts of places. They are a major part of the convoy war in the Arctic. They're a major part of several of the operations, but they are some of the newer cruisers, so of course they do end up going into the Indian Ocean and the major fleet operations. It's like you find a town class end up out there. Basically, after a certain amount of time, as I said, once the Italians are out the war and the Germans' surface units are really contained, basically after D-Day, things just go whoosh out there. Scrub, I wonder if the time difference from US cuts down on viewership. I know I put headphones on to watch till I'm needed. Cool. Well, thank you for staying and watching. Paul, this was a great stream, and I haven't seen sequel on YouTube. We'll almost this when eventually a few thousand viewers are watching. I will try and keep it to the same style. I might have more trouble in those circumstances. I sometimes tune into Drax, and I'm watching all those questions go up, and I'm going, that would take me forever to answer, because I would want to answer them all. He does have methodologies, and he's probably going to try and teach me at some point. But at some point, he and I are going to be sitting down in a pub having a drink and working it all out. And probably me picking his brains and buying him several rounds of Iron Brew, because I know there's a pub in Surrey that does serve Iron Brew on tap. Jeff B. I owe all this to Googling Vickers 6-ton tank and finding David Fletcher's Tank Museum talk. YouTube led me to from there to Drac via the Chieftain. Oh, cool. Golden Eagle, RAF Airbase where you are? Not many, particularly in my area, but they're not that far away. Jeff B. Dr. Clark's live chats are more mellow than Drax. The Chieftain is pretty chill too. Well, as I said, I treat this as a seminar. And this is how I run seminars. And I have 30 to 40 students in them. And that's quite interesting when you have them in your face. And then you have another 30 to 40 turn up from next hour. And another 30 to 40 to turn up from next hour. So you do 3 hours of seminars. And that's usually following a 2-hour lecture to about 900 students on some occasions. You can imagine that, me having to teach 900. So that is why I get quite loud sometimes, because I slip into lecturing mode, and I get quite expressive, and I do all this, because I am used to teaching 600 to 900 students at the time for 2 hours, and not stop talking, and you keep going for 2 hours, and, you know, it's how I am in that sort of way. Right. Shomak, I'm not finding any tier list for Admiral, so if someone sends me a list on the Discord, I can make one in my free time. Would be a fun video. That would be cool. Kevin Tank, stream runs 12 to 3 p.m. in US Central Time. So it's really midday. Ray Sassy. Al Sassy. Al Sassy seems to be having fun with the moderators. I'm not sure what's going on, but I think it's probably neating up your language. Carmen, we should all go bombard a Navy Museum at the same time with have a massive gathering. That would be quite cool. I have been talking with Drac about that as an idea. Maybe doing a trip down to Portsmouth at some point. It's from Max. Sorry, Albert. So sorry, my phone freaked out. Oh, come on. We should. Danny Freeman, the Chieftain is Irish. Of course, he has a good sense of humor. To be fair, yes. Carl Gasman, for my part, I'm either doing household stuff with earplugs or stop the stream and get back at 1.25 speed. This is when Dr. Clark said, "I am not an Iron Brew addict." Yeah, I'm not. I promise. The Sundays are always going to have most numbers. Sundays are fun. I love the brew ships because it's a book review, and it's the way I'd like books to be reviewed. Because I'd like it. I love the idea of a book being reviewed and someone going, "This is good pictures, this is this in it." Because when you read book reviews, they're always either super critical or super positive, and you sit there and go, that's not the reality. Everything has compromises. Even my own book, before it comes out, there is a compromise in it. And when you read it after having talked to me, you will see the compromises. And the reason is because of the word limit. There is a word limit. There is only so much I can fit in. And I want to fit in more, but there are limits to what you can do. And it's still going to be a great book, but I know there's a compromise in it. And it's still a book which I am 100% positive everyone's going to love. And the pictures that have been picked out for it are gorgeous. I have really worked hard on those and getting those. And Drac has been massively helpful and key to getting it. But in some of those pictures, because Drac's collection is colossal and Drac has basically gone, what can we do? How can we work this one out? And because I was having so many trouble with the collections, because they weren't responding because of COVID and all these things, and it was going to have to be delayed forever. But it's absolutely beautiful because of that. But it's taken a lot of work to get it to that. Mm-hmm. Jeff Miller, experience will show. Iron 1000 and 10,000 free. Can you buy Iron Brew on the MT after Brexit asking for Sweden. You can buy Iron Brew, will still be available. Don't worry. Brexit's not going to stop Iron Brew being sent to Sweden. It'll be fine. The one thing I am certain of is that they will find a way to make these things work. It might be annoying and there might be a lot of shouting doing it, but they'll work it out because in the end it's better for everyone if it does work. They just want to try and get. Everyone's trying to get the best position they can to try and get a win. So they're going to make a lot of noise. Just ignore it. International relations are like that. Britain has had to do trade negotiations a long time. We don't understand the emotional process which goes on around them as well as a nation as we used to. Believe it or not, this is perfectly normal, this kind of blustering and talking in trade negotiations. You should see what happened between American and Russian trade negotiations during the Cold War, or even American-Chinese ones these days when they have trade meetings. We do need to go to Bovington. Bovington will be fun. And Daniel Freeman. Vision. Charles de Gaulle's finest moment was likely during the 1961 Battle of the Transistors. Love his portrayal in 1973. Yeah. Bot Prane, yes, the stream is 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. in my time zone. At 10 o'clock. I fat fingered the timeout, Bichon. Sorry. You've timed out Bichon as well? Sure, Mac, are you just being cruel to people now? Don't worry, carry on. It's quite fun. It's putting some jeopardy into it. So giving freeze on to the messages. 2 minutes now. Hi at a meeting Sunday. That would be good, Jeff. That would be really good. Gary Seltzer, that message to Albert you got stuck on was referring to the channel's Arson, Depth History of World War I Firearms. Excellent if you haven't seen it. Oh, I'll have to go have a look at it. Richard, to be honest, I have problems making these. I enjoy them, but I do need to work too. Yeah, that is my problem. But luckily, I'm trying to. I very kindly tell my family this is work. Yeah, that's what I tell them. As long as I'm technically there's money being put into the Patreon, I think I can just about swing that as being the case. Patreon and the that's why I have advertising as well, because even though I have it on the minimal setting possible, I have it so I can tell my family this is work, honestly. Can we expect a bilge pumps featuring the Chieftain? You never know. As I said, the first one I've arranged this one, and the next next guest has got to be arranged by one of my two compadres. So we'll see who they get. Go Neil, Dr. Clark, can you do a war game tutorial one day? Yeah. Me and Drac have considered doing a joint one on that one, because it's easier if you do have two people to talk about it, so one can do their movings while the other one explains it, I think. Thank you, Kevin. That's for the Iron Brew Fund. All right. Vision, I would be watching these videos if it was working, unemployed due to pandemic. Since I work 6 days a week, one nice benefit of being home now. That is good. That is a benefit, but you know. Paul Howard, Dr. Clark, you used an image of HMCS Sackville in an old video. Looked it up on Wikipedia, only discovered the plot of the K Mutiny had played out on board. Fascinating. So many of these fun things happen. Sackville has a great history. Martin Doherty, I came across this accident and I'm hooked on it. Been in and out of hospital for the last few months, and this channel has kept me sane. I'm glad it's been of help. I was asking. Had to wait until my send button loads back. I'm glad I said it. Jerrison, hello. Probably over soon. Sorry I'm late, but my enjoyed her birthday. Did I miss anything good? I think it was quite good. Jay. It technically ended a minute ago, but you know, Chicago Eskimos alive. Thank you. That's cool. Not nighttime production, not to take away from the good Dr. Clark, but there is a good series on the Iraq War on BBC Two right now. It's called Once Upon a Time in Iraq. It's episode 2 now. Episode 1's a good documentary. It is a good one. I've been watching it on catch up. Minority meant I came across the channel by accident and I'm hooked. Been in and out hospital. Oof. As I said, good luck. I hope you get better soon. I hope you get sorted. I'm glad I can be of help. With that said, thank you for the lecture as always. Good night. Good night. Good night, Night Harry Production. It is now technically 9:31, so I'm going to start winding it down a bit. Thank you again, as always. While I remember, before I answer questions on this thing, thank you to all my subscribers. Thank you to all my patrons. Thank you to all the people who like. Thank you to all the people who share. Thank you to all the people who super chat. And thank you to all the people who pre-order my book. You're keeping my publishers very happy. They're being very, very kind to me, so there must be quite a few of you. I've had out there this kind to all first time sort of people getting their books through publishing. But they are lovely, being lovely. So night, everyone, and thank you. I'm now going to finish up these questions. Right then. Shomack, I really feel really bad about that. My laptop should be back soon. I'll be better for this. Thank you, Shomack. Don't worry, you're doing a very good job. You've been working hard. Carl Harmon, on that note, I will have a look if I can afford to be a patron. Thank you. That's very kind of you. Actually, my patron is set up at £3. I set it at the minimum rate, so people can basically put what they like there if they want just £3 or more. And what I do is I upload the slides, and of course you get to both put forward suggestions for the patron and then vote on the final suggestions as to what the patron topics will be. And I think the patron topics have so far been cool. This is the second one, and it's been cool. And we've got 3 scheduled for August because number 2 and number 3 tied for votes, so I ended up doing 3. Please don't do that to me again. It's difficult to work out. It's fun, but it's difficult. Yeah, I've got the same problem, though. When I can't listen, I just make sure to turn on the video and mute it so the doc still gets you. Thank you, Brock. Carmen, I'll call myself Lord Brew. Enjoy. Walkie's time. That is pretty much what I'm learning off to do. Once it's not working again, you'll have another paying student, so one more for the student. Thank you. Jeffy, Michael Clapp starting his own channel. I don't think so, but I think he's looking forward to chatting with Drac and Jamie, and I think if he enjoys it enough, this might not be the first and last time on Bilge Pumps. It might well be a case of, hello, Michael, you've decided you want to join us again to discuss something. Because he's got a few topics. We're doing amphibious warfare this time and the future of that. But he's also got ideas on naval diplomacy and training of naval officers. And it's quite interesting listening to him because, I might not, and I will admit this, I'm not a lettuce leaf. I don't always agree with 100% with everything he's saying because sometimes I feel technology's moved on. I feel there's a slightly different context to put in place. But what is amazing is when you're listening to him, you're thinking, this is one of the few people who has successfully commanded forces in war and who's still alive. And it was a full-on naval war, full-on amphibious operation. There is a reason the US Marine Corps has him come out to the university to give lectures. There's a reason the Australians used to fly him out to Australia to give lectures. And him and Julian Thompson used to go together and give lectures. He is full of ideas, of excellent ideas. Bad Home question: if Iron Brew were to give you sponsorship, how much easier it would be if they just sent a truck with Iron Brew case instead of money? We won't talk quite how much that could be easier. Thank you again, Martin. Thank you, Brock. Thank you, Stafford. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Martin, again. Thank you, Bitchon. Thank you, Damon Freeman. And that sounds awesome. It does. It is going to be a lot of fun. Anyway, Ryan, thank you, everyone. Thank you. Take care. And I'm now going to go to the hold screen because I have that working now. I'm going to exit that. That appears there. Everything keeps up to date, hopefully. And thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Take care.